Chapter 16. The Aurora's Drift. After Mackintosh left the Aurora on January 25, 1915, Stenhouse kept the ship with difficulty off Tent Island. The ice anchors would not hold, owing to the continual breaking away of the pack, and he found it necessary much of the time to steam slow ahead against the floes. The third sledging party, under Cope, left the ship on the afternoon of the 31st, with the motor tractor towing 2 sledges, and disappeared towards Hut Point. Cope's party returned to the ship on February 2 and left again on February 5, after a delay caused by the loose condition of the ice. 2 days later, after more trouble with drifting floes, Stenhouse proceeded to Cape Evans, where he took a line of soundings for the winter quarters. During the next month the Aurora occupied various positions in the neighborhood of Cape Evans. No secure moorings were available. The ship had to keep clear of threatening floes, dodge growlers and drifting bergs, and find shelter from the blizzards. A sudden shift of wind on February 24, when the ship was sheltering in the lee of Glacier Tongue, caused her to be jammed hard against the low ice off the glacier, but no damage was done. Early in March Stenhouse sent moorings ashore at Cape Evans, and on March 11 he proceeded to Hut Point, where he dropped anchor in Discovery Bay. Here he landed stores, amounting to about 2 months' full rations for 12 men, and embarked Spencer Smith, Stevens, Hook, Richards, Ninnis, and Gaze, with 2 dogs. He returned to Cape Evans that evening. We had a bad time when we were sculling about the Sound, first endeavoring to make Hut Point to land provisions, and then looking for winter quarters in the neighborhood of Glacier Tongue. Wrote Stenhouse afterwards. The ice kept breaking away in small floes, and we were apparently no nearer to anywhere than when the sledges left. We were frustrated in every move. The ship broke away from the fast ice in blizzards, and then we went dodging about the Sound from the Ross Island side to the western pack. Avoiding and clearing floes and growlers in heavy drift, and we could see nothing, our compasses unreliable and the ship short-handed. In that homeless time I kept watch with the second officer, and was hard-pressed to know what to do. Was ever ship in such predicament? To the northward of Cape Royds was taboo, as also was the coast south of Glacier Tongue. In a small stretch of icebound coast we had to find winter quarters. The ice lingered on, and all this time we could find nowhere to drop anchor, but had to keep steam handy for emergencies. Once I tried the north bay of Cape Evans, as it apparently was the only ice-free spot. I called all hands, and making up a boat's crew with one of the firemen sent the whaler away with the second officer in charge to sound. No sooner had the boat left ship than the wind freshened from the northward, and large bergs and growlers, setting into the bay, made the place untenable. The anchorage I eventually selected seemed the best available, and here we are drifting, with all plans upset, when we ought to be lying in winter quarters. A heavy gale came up on March 12, and the Aurora, then moored off Cape Evans, dragged her anchor and drifted out of the bay. She went northward past Cape Barne and Cape Royds in a driving mist, with a heavy storm sea running. This gale was a particularly heavy one. The ship and gear were covered with ice, owing to the freezing of spray, and Stenhouse had anxious hours amid the heavy, ice-encumbered waters before the gale moderated. The young ice, which was continually forming in the very low temperature, helped to reduce the sea as soon as the gale moderated, and the Aurora got back to Cape Evans on the evening of the 13th. Ice was forming in the bay, and on the morning of the 14th Stenhouse took the ship into position for winter moorings. He got 3 steel hawsers out and made fast to the shore anchors. These hawsers were hove tight, and the Aurora rested then, with her stern to the shore, in 7 fathoms. 2 more wires were taken ashore the next day. Young ice was forming around the ship, and under the influence of wind and tide this ice began early to put severe strains upon the moorings. Stenhouse had the fires drawn and the boiler blown down on the 20th, and the engineer reported at that time that the bunkers contained still 118 tons of coal. The ice broke away between Cape Evans and Cape Barne on the 23rd, and pressure around the ship shattered the bay ice and placed heavy strains on the stern moorings. The young ice, about 4 inches thick, went out eventually and left a lead along the shore. The ship had set in towards the shore, owing to the pressure, and the stern was now in 4.5 fathoms. Stenhouse tightened the moorings and ran out an extra wire to the shore anchor. The nature of the ice movements is illustrated by a few extracts from the log. March 27, 5 p.m., ice broke away from shore and started to go out. 8 p.m., light southerly airs, fine. Ice setting out to northwest, heavy pressure of ice on starboard side and great strain on moorings. 10 p.m., ice clear of ship. March 28, new ice forming over bay. 3 a.m. Ice which went out last watched set in towards bay. 5 a.m., ice coming in and overriding newly formed bay ice, heavy pressure on port side of ship, wires frozen into ice. 8 a.m., calm and fine. New ice setting out of bay. 5 p.m., new ice formed since morning cleared from bay except area on port side of ship and stretching abeam and ahead for about 200 yards, which is held by bights of wire. New ice forming. March 29, 1:30 p.m., new ice going out. 2 p.m., hands on floe on port quarter clearing wires, stern in 3 fathoms. Hauled wires tight, bringing stern more to eastward and in 4 fathoms, hove in about 1 fathom of starboard cable, which had dragged during recent pressure. April 10, 1:30 p.m. Ice breaking from shore under influence of southeast wind. 2 starboard quarter wires parted, all bights of stern wires frozen in ice, chain taking weight. 2 p.m. Ice opened, leaving ice in bay in line from cape to landward of glacier. 8 p.m., fresh wind, ship holding ice in bay, ice in sound wind driven to northwest. April 17, 1 a.m. Pressure increased and wind shifted to northwest. Ice continued to override and press into shore until 5 o'clock, during this time pressure into bay was very heavy. Movement of ice in straits causing noise like heavy surf. Ship took ground gently at rudder post during pressure, bottom under stern shallows very quickly. 10 p.m., ice moving out of bay to westward. Heavy strain on after moorings and cables, which are cutting the flow. Stenhouse continued to nurse his moorings against the onslaughts of the ice during the rest of April and the early days of May. The breakaway from the shore came suddenly and unexpectedly on the evening of May 6. May 6, 1915, fine morning with light breezes from east-southeast. 3:30 p.m., ice nearly finished. Sent hands ashore for sledge load. 4 p.m., wind freshening with blizzardy appearance of sky. 8 p.m. Heavy strain on after moorings. 9:45 p.m., the ice parted from the shore. All moorings parted. Most fascinating to listen to waves and chain breaking. In the thick haze I saw the ice astern breaking up and the shore receding. I called all hands and clapped relieving tackles, 4 inches. Manila luff tackles, onto the cables on the forepart of the windlass. The boatswain had rushed along with his hurricane lamp, and shouted, "She's away, why, it. He is a good fellow and very conscientious." I ordered steam on main engines, and the engine room staff, with Hook and Ninnis, turned to. Grady, fireman, was laid up with a broken rib. As the ship, in the solid flow, set to the northwest, the cables rattled and tore at the hawsepipes. Luckily the anchors, lying as they were on a strip-sloping bottom, came away easily, without damage to windlass or hawsepipes. Slowly as we disappeared into sound, the light in the hut died away. At 11:30 p.m. the ice around us started to break up, the floes playing tattoo on the ship's sides. We were out in the sound and catching the full force of the wind. The moon broke through the clouds after midnight and showed us the pack, stretching continuously to northward, and about 1 mile to the south. As the pack from the southward came up and closed in on the ship, the swell lessened and the banging of floes alongside eased a little. May 7, 8 a.m., wind east-southeast. Moderate gale with thick drift. The ice around ship is packing up and forming ridges about 2 feet high. The ship is lying with head to the eastward, Cape Bird showing to northeast. When steam is raised, I have hopes of getting back to the fast ice near the glacier tongue. Since we have been in winter quarters, the ice has formed and, held by the islands and land at Cape Evans, has remained north of the tongue. If we can return, we should be able now to moor to the fast ice. The engineers are having great difficulty with the sea connections, which are frozen. The main bow-down cock, from which the boiler is run up, has been tapped and a screw plug put into it to allow of a hot iron rod being inserted to thaw out the ice between the cock and the ship's side, about 2 feet of hard ice. For 30 p.m., the hot iron has been successful. Donnelly, second engineer, had the pleasure of stopping the first spurt of water through the pipe. He got it in the eye. Fires were lit in furnaces, and water commenced to blow in the boiler, the first blow in our defense against the terrific forces of nature in the Antarctic. 8 p.m. The gale has freshened, accompanied by thick drift. The Aurora drifted helplessly throughout May 7th. On the morning of May 8th the weather cleared a little and the western mountains became indistinctly visible. Cape Bird could also be seen. The ship was moving northwards with the ice. The daylight was no more than a short twilight of about 2 hours' duration. The boiler was being filled with ice, which had to be lifted aboard, broken up, passed through a small porthole to a man inside, and then carried to the manhole on top of the boiler. Stenhouse had the wireless aerial rigged during the afternoon, and at 5 p.m. was informed that the watering of the boiler was complete. The wind freshened to a moderate southerly gale, with thick drift, in the night, and this gale continued during the following day, the 9th. The engineer reported at noon that he had 40 pounds pressure in the boiler and was commencing the thawing of the auxiliary sea connection pump by means of a steam pipe. Cape Bird is the only land visible, bearing northeast true about 8 miles distant, wrote Stenhouse on the afternoon of the 9th, so this is the end of our attempt to winter in McMurdo Sound. Hard luck after 4 months buffeting, for the last 7 weeks of which we nursed our moorings. Our present situation calls for increasing vigilance. It is 5 weeks to the middle of winter. There is no sun, the light is little and uncertain, and we may expect many blizzards. We have no immediate water supply, as only a small quantity of fresh ice was aboard when we broke drift. The Aurora is fast in the pack and drifting God knows where. Well, there are prospects of a most interesting winter drift. We are all in good health, except Grady, whose rib is mending rapidly. We have good spirits and we will get through. But what of the poor beggars at Cape Evans, and the southern party? It is a dismal prospect for them. There are sufficient provisions at Cape Evans, Hut Point, and, I suppose, Cape Royds, but we have the remaining Burberrys, clothing, etc., for next year's sledging still on board. I see little prospect of getting back to Cape Evans or anywhere in the Sound. We are short of coal and held firmly in the ice. I hope she drifts quickly to the northeast. Then we can endeavor to push through the pack and make for New Zealand, coal and return to the barrier eastward of Cape Crozier. This could be done, I think, in the early spring, September. We must get back to aid the depot-laying next season. A violent blizzard raged on May 10th and 11th. I never remember such wind force, said Stenhouse. It was difficult to get along the deck. The weather moderated on the 12th, and a survey of the ship's position was possible. We are lying in a field of ice with our anchors and 75 fathoms of cable on each hanging at the bows. The after moorings were frozen into the ice astern of us at Cape Evans. Previous to the date of our leaving our winter berth 4 small wires had parted. When we broke away the chain 2 of the heavy, 4 inches, wires parted close to shore, the other wire went at the butts. The chain and 2 wires are still fast in the ice and will have to be dug out. This morning we cleared the ice around the cables, but had to abandon the heaving in, as the steam froze in the return pipes from the windlass exhaust. And the joints had to be broken and the pipe thawed out. Hooke was listening in from 8:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. for the Macquarie Island wireless station, 1,340 miles away, or the Bluff, New Zealand, station, 1,860 miles away, but had no luck. The anchors were hove in by dint of much effort on the 13th and 14th, ice forming on the cable as it was hoisted through a hole cut in the floe. Both anchors had broken, so the Aurora had now one small kedge anchor left aboard. The ship's position on May 14 was approximately 45 miles north, 34 west of Cape Evans. In 1 week we have drifted 45 miles, geographical. Most of this distance was covered during the first 2 days of the drift. We appear to be nearly stationary. What movement there is in the ice seems to be to the northwest towards the icebound coast. Hands who were after penguins yesterday reported much noise in the ice about 1 mile from the ship. I hope the floe around the ship is large enough to take its own pressure. We cannot expect much pressure from the south, as McMurdo Sound should soon be frozen over and the ice holding. Northeast winds would drive the pack in from the Ross Sea. I hope for the best. Plans for future development are ready, but probably will be checkmated again. I took the anchors aboard. They are of no further use as separate anchors, but they ornament the forecastle head, so we put them in their places. The supply of fresh water is a problem. The engineer turned steam from the boiler into the main water tank, starboard, through a pipe leading from the main winch pipe to the tank top. The steam condenses before reaching the tank. I hope freezing does not burst the tank. A large tabular iceberg, calved from the barrier, is silhouetted against the twilight glow in the sky about 10 miles away. The sight of millions of tons of fresh ice is most tantalizing. It would be a week's journey to the berg and back over pack and pressure, and probably we could bring enough ice to last 2 days. The record of the early months of the Aurora's long drift in the Ross Sea is not eventful. The galley condenser was rigged, but the supply of fresh water remained a problem. The men collected fresh fallen snow when possible and hoped to get within reach of fresh ice. Hooke and Ninnis worked hard at the wireless plant with the object of getting into touch with Macquarie Island, and possibly sending news of the ship's movements to Cape Evans. They got the wireless motor running and made many adjustments of the instruments and aerials, but their efforts were not successful. Emperor penguins approached the ship occasionally, and the birds were captured whenever possible for the fresh meat they afforded. The Aurora was quite helpless in the grip of the ice, and after the engine room bilges had been thawed and pumped out the boilers were blown down. The pressure had been raised to 60 pounds, but there was no chance of moving the ship, and the supply of coal was limited. The story of the Aurora's drift during long months can be told briefly by means of extracts from Stenhouse's log. May 21, early this morning there appeared to be movements in the ice. The grating and grinding noise makes one feel the unimportance of man in circumstances like ours. Twilight towards noon showed several narrow, open leads about 2 cables from ship and in all directions. Unable to get bearing, but imagine that there is little or no alteration in ship's position, as ship's head is same, and western mountains appear the same. Hope all is well at Cape Evans and that the other parties have returned safely. Wish we could relieve their anxiety. May 22. Obtained good bearings of Beaufort Island, Cape Ross, and Dunlop Island, which put the ship in a position 18 miles south 75 degrees east, true, from Cape Ross. Since the 14th, when reliable bearings were last obtained, we have drifted northwest by north 7 miles. May 24, blizzard from south-southeast continued until 9 p.m. When it moderated, and at 11:45 p.m. wind shifted to northwest, light, with snow. Quite a lot of havoc has been caused during this blow, and the ship has made much northing. In the morning the crack south of the ship opened to about 3 feet. At 2 p.m. felt heavy shock and the ship heeled to port about 70 degrees. Found ice had cracked from port gangway to northwest, and parted from ship from gangway along to stern. Crack extended from stern to southeast. 7:35 p.m. Ice cracked from port 4 chains, in line parallel to previous crack. The ice broke again between the cracks and drifted to northwest for about 10 yards. The ice to southward then commenced to break up, causing heavy strain on ship, and setting apparently north in large broken fields. Ship badly jammed in. 9:15 p.m., ice closed in again around ship. 2 heavy wind squalls with a short interval between followed by cessation of wind. We are in a labyrinth of large rectangular floes, some with their points pressing heavily against ship, and high-pressure ridges. May 25, in middle watch felt pressure occasionally. Twilight showed a scene of chaos all around. One floe about 3 feet in thickness had upended, driven under ship on port quarter. As far as can be seen there are heavy blocks of ice screwed up on end, and the scene is like a graveyard. I think swell must have come up under ice from seaward, northeast, McMurdo Sound, and broken the ice, which afterward started to move under the influence of the blizzard. Hardly think swell came from the Sound, as the cracks were wending from northwest to southeast, and also as the Sound should be getting icebound by now. If swell came from northeast then there is open water not far away. I should like to know. I believe the Ross Sea is rarely entirely ice-covered. Have bright moonlight now, which accentuates everything, the beauty and loneliness of our surroundings, and uselessness of ourselves. While in this prison, so near to Cape Evans and yet we might as well be anywhere as here. Have made our sledging ration scales, and crew are busy making harness and getting sledging equipment ready for emergencies. Temperature -30 degrees Fahrenheit. May 26. If the ship is nipped in the ice, the ship's company, 18 hands, will take to 4 sledges with 1 month's rations and make for nearest land. 6 men and 1 sledge will endeavor to make Cape Evans via the western land, Butler Point, Hut Point, etc. The remaining 12 will come along with all possible speed, but no forced marches, killing and depot-ing penguins and seals for emergency retreats. If the ship remains here and makes no further drift to the north, towards latter end of July light will be making. The sun returns August 23. The sea ice should be fairly safe, and a party of 3, with 1 month's rations, will proceed to Cape Evans. If the ice sets north and takes the ship clear of land, we will proceed to New Zealand, bunker, get extra officer and 4 volunteers, provisions, etc. Push south with all speed to the barrier, put party onto the barrier, about 2 miles east of Cape Crozier, and land all necessary stores and requirements. The ship will stand off until able to reach Cape Evans. If necessary, party will depot all stores possible at Corner Camp and go on to Cape Evans. If worst has happened my party will lay out the depot at the Beardmore for Shackleton. If the ship is released from the ice after September we must endeavor to reach Cape Evans before going north to bunker. We have not enough coal to hang about the Sound for many days. May 28. By the position obtained by meridian altitude of stars and bearing of Mount Melbourne, we have drifted 36 miles northeast from last bearings taken on 23rd inst. The most of this must have been during the blizzard of the 24th. Mount Melbourne is 111 miles due north of us, and there is some doubt in my mind as to whether the peak which we can see is this mountain. There may be a mirage. In the evening had the football out on the ice by the light of a beautiful moon. The exercise and break from routine are a splendid tonic. Ice noises sent all hands on board. June 1. Thick, hazy weather. In the afternoon a black streak appeared in the ice about a cable's length to the westward and stretching north and south. 8 p.m. The black line widened and showed long lane of open water. Apparently we are fast in a floe which has broken from the main field. With thick weather we are uncertain of our position and drift. It will be interesting to find out what this crack in the ice signifies. I am convinced that there is open water, not far distant, in the Ross Sea. Tonight Hook is trying to call up Cape Evans. If the people at the hut have rigged the set which was left there, they will hear "all well" from the Aurora. I hope they have. The messages were not received. June 8. Made our latitude 75 degrees 59 minutes south by altitude of Sirius. This is a very monotonous life, but all hands appear to be happy and contented. Find that we are not too well off for meals and will have to cut rations a little. Grady is taking exercise now and should soon be well again. He seems very anxious to get to work again, and is a good man. No wireless calls tonight, as there is a temporary breakdown, condenser jar broken. There is a very faint display of Aurora in northern sky. It comes and goes almost imperceptibly, a most fascinating sight. The temperature is -20 degrees Fahrenheit. 52 degrees of frost is much too cold to allow one to stand for long. June 11, walked over to a very high pressure ridge about a quarter of a mile north-northwest of the ship. In the dim light, walking over the ice is far from being monotonous, as it is almost impossible to see obstacles, such as small, snowed-up ridges, which makes us wary and cautious. A dip in the sea would be the grand finale, but there is little risk of this as the water freezes as soon as a lane opens in the ice. The pressure ridge is about 15 to 20 feet high for several hundred feet, and the ice all about it is bent up in a most extraordinary manner. At 9 p.m. Hook called Cape Evans, all well, Aurora, etc. 10 p.m., weather reports for 8 p.m. sent to Wellington, New Zealand, and Melbourne, via Macquarie Island. The dispatch of messages from the Aurora was continued, but it was learned afterwards that none of them had been received by any station. June 13. The temperature in the chart room ranges from 0 to a little above freezing point. This is a very disturbing factor in rates of the chronometers, 5 in number, 3 GMT and 2 SID.T, which are kept in cases in a padded box, each case covered by a piece of blanket, and the box covered by a heavy coat. In any enclosed place where people pass their time, the niches and places where no heat penetrates are covered with frozen breath. There will be a big thaw-out when the temperature rises. June 14. Mount Melbourne is bearing north 14 degrees west, true. Our approximate position is 40 miles east-northeast of Nordenskjold ice tongue. At 9 p.m. Hook called Cape Evans and sent weather reports to Wellington and Melbourne via Macquarie Island. Hook and Ninnis on several evenings at about 11 o'clock have heard what happened to be faint messages, but unreadable. He sent word to Macquarie Island of this in hopes that they would hear and increase the power. June 20. During this last blow with its accompanying drift snow there has been much leakage of current from the aerial during the sending of reports. This is apparently due to induction caused by the snow accumulating on the insulators aloft, and thus rendering them useless. And probably to increased inductive force of the current in a body of snowdrift. Hook appears to be somewhat downhearted over it, and, after discussing the matter, gave me a written report on the non-success, up to the present time, of his endeavors to establish communication. He thinks that the proximity of the magnetic pole and Aurora Australis might affect things. The radiation is good and sufficient for normal conditions. His suggestion to lead the down-lead wires out to the ahead and astern would increase scope, but I cannot countenance it owing to unsettled state of ice and our two lofty poles. June 21. Blowing gale from southwest throughout day, but for short spell of westerly breeze about 5 p.m. light drift at frequent intervals, very hazy, and consequently no land in sight during short twilight. Very hard up for mitts and clothing. What little we have on board I have put to one side for the people at the hut. Have given Thompson instructions to turn crew to making pair mitts and helmet out of Jaeger fleece for all hands forward. With strict economy we should make things spin out. Cannot help worrying over our people at the hut. Although worrying does no good, one cannot do otherwise in this present impotent state. 11 p.m., wind howling and whistling through rigging. Outside, in glare of moon, flying drift and expanse of ice field. Desolation. June 22, today the sun has reached the limit of his northern declination and now he will start to come south. Observed this day as holiday, and in the evening had hands aft to drink to the health of the king and the expedition. All hands are happy, but miss the others at Cape Evans. I pray to God we may soon be clear of this prison and in a position to help them. We can live now for sunlight and activity. July 1, the 1st of July. Thank God. The days pass quickly. Through all my waking hours one long thought of the people at Cape Evans, but one must appear to be happy and take interest in the small happenings of shipboard. July 3rd. Rather hazy with very little light. Moderate west-northwest to southwest winds until noon, when wind veered to south and freshened. No apparent change in ship's position. The berg is on the same bearing, 1 point on the port quarter, and apparently the same distance off. Mount Melbourne was hidden behind a bank of clouds. This is our only landmark now, as Franklin Island is towered in perpetual gloom. Although we have had the berg in sight during all the time of our drift from the entrance to McMurdo Sound, we have not yet seen it in a favorable light, and, were it not for its movement, we might mistake it for a tabular island. It will be interesting to view our companion in the returning light, unless we are too close to it. July 5, dull gray day, during twilight, with light, variable, westerly breezes. All around hangs a heavy curtain of haze, and, although very light snow is falling, overhead is black and clear with stars shining. As soon as the faint noon light fades away, the heavy low haze intensifies the darkness and makes one thankful that one has a good firm berth in the ice. I don't care to contemplate the scene if the ice should break up at the present time. July 6. Last night I thought I saw open water in the shape of a long black lane to the southward of the ship and extending in an easterly and westerly direction. But owing to the haze and light snow I could not be sure. This morning the lane was distinctly visible and appeared to be 200 or 300 yards wide and 2 miles long. At 6 p.m. loud pressure noises would be heard from the direction of the open lane and continued throughout the night. Shortly after 8 o'clock the grinding and hissing spread to our starboard bow, west-southwest, and the vibration caused by the pressure could be felt intermittently on board the ship. The incessant grinding and grating of the ice to the southward, with seething noises, as of water rushing under the ship's bottom, and ominous sounds, kept me on the qui-vive all night. And the prospect of a break-up of the ice would have racked my nerves had I not had them numbed by previous experiences. July 9, at noon the sky to the northward had cleared sufficiently to allow of seeing Mount Melbourne, which appears now as a low peak to the northwest. Ship's position is 28 miles north-northeast of Franklin Island. On the port bow and ahead of the ship there are some enormous pressure ridges. They seem to be the results of the recent and present ice movements. Pressure heard from the southward all day. July 13, at 5 p.m. Very heavy pressure was heard on the port beam and bow, south, and very close to the ship. This occurred again at irregular intervals. Quite close to the ship the ice could be seen bending upwards, and occasional jars were felt on board. I am inclined to think that we have set into a cul-de-sac and that we will now experience the full force of pressure from the south. We have prepared for the worst and can only hope for the best, a release from the ice with a seaworthy vessel under us. July 18, this has been a day of events. About 8 a.m. the horizon to the north became clear and, as the light grew, the more westerly land showed up. This is the first clear day that we have had since the 9th of the month, and we have set a considerable distance to the northeast in the meantime. By meridian altitudes of stars and bearings of the land, which proved to be Coleman Islands, Mount Murchison, and Mount Melbourne, our position shows 78 miles, geographical, northeast by north of Franklin Island. During the last 3 days we have drifted 40 miles, geographical, so there has been ample reason for all the grinding and growling of pressure lately. The ship endured some severe squeezes this day. July 20, shortly before breakfast the raucous voice of the Emperor Penguin was heard, and afterwards two were seen some distance from the ship. The nearest mainland, in vicinity of Cape Washington, is 90 miles distant, as also is Coleman Island. Franklin Island is 80 miles southeast by south, and the pack is in motion. This is the Emperor's hatching season, and here we meet them out in the cheerless desert of ice. 10:45 p.m., heavy pressure around ship, lanes opened and ship worked astern about 20 feet. The wires in the ice took the strain, lashings at mizzen chains carried away fair lead bollard on port side of forecastle head. July 21st, 1 a.m., lanes open to about 40 feet wide. Ship in open pool about 100 feet wide. Heavy pressure in vicinity of ship. Called all hands and cut wires at the forecastle head. These wires had remained frozen in the ice after the ship broke away from her moorings, and they had served a useful purpose at some times by checking ice movements close to the ship. 2 a.m. Ship swung athwart lane as the ice opened, and the floes on the port side pressed her stern round. 11:30 a.m., pack of killer whales came up in the lane around the ship. Some broke soft ice, about 1 inch thick, and pushed their heads through, rising to 5 or 6 feet perpendicularly out of the water. They were apparently having a look round. It is strange to see killers in this immense field of ice. Open water must be near, I think. 5:15 p.m., new ice of lanes cracked and opened. Floes on port side pushed stern onto ice, of floe. Floes then closed in and nipped the ship fore and aft. The rudder was bent over to starboard and smashed. The solid oak and iron went like matchwood. 8 p.m., moderate south-southwest gale with drift. Much straining of timbers with pressure. 10 p.m., extra hard nip fore and aft, ship visibly hogged. Heavy pressure. July 22nd. Ship in bad position in newly frozen lane, with bow and stern jammed against heavy floes, heavy strain with much creaking and groaning. 8 a.m. Called all hands to stations for sledges, and made final preparations for abandoning ship. Allotted special duties to several hands to facilitate quickness in getting clear should ship be crushed. I am afraid the ship's back will be broken if the pressure continues, but cannot relieve her. 2 p.m., ship lying easier. Poured sulfuric acid on the ice astern in hopes of rotting crack and relieving pressure on stern post, but unsuccessfully. Very heavy pressure on and around ship, taking strain fore and aft and on starboard quarter. Ship, jumping and straining and listing badly. 10 p.m. Ship has crushed her way into new ice on starboard side and slewed aslant lane with sternpost clear of land ice. 12 p.m., ship is in safer position, lanes opening in every direction. July 23rd. Caught glimpse of Coleman Island through haze. Position of ship south 14 degrees east, true, 80 miles off Coleman Island. Pressure continued intermittently throughout the day and night, with occasional very heavy squeezes to the ship which made timbers crack and groan. The ship's stern is now in a more or less soft bed, formed of recently frozen ice of about 1 foot in thickness. I thank God that we have been spared through this fearful nightmare. I shall never forget the concertina motions of the ship during yesterday's and Wednesday's fore and aft nips. July 24, compared with previous days this is a quiet one. The lanes have been opening and closing, and occasionally the ship gets a nasty squeeze against the solid floe on our starboard quarter. The more lanes that open the better, as they form springs when covered with thin ice, which makes to a thickness of 3 or 4 inches in a few hours, between the solid and heavier floes and fields. Surely we have been guided by the hands of Providence to have come in heavy grinding pack for over 200 miles, geographical, skirting the icebound western shore. Around and to the north of Franklin Island, and now into what appears a clear path to the open sea. In view of our precarious position and the lives of men in jeopardy, I sent this evening an aerogram to H.M. King George asking for a relief ship. I hope the wireless gets through. I have sent this message after much consideration. And know that in the event of our non-arrival in New Zealand on the specified date, November 1st, a relief ship will be sent to aid the southern party. July 25, very heavy pressure about the ship. During the early hours a large field on the port quarter came charging up, and on meeting our floe tossed up a ridge from 10 to 15 feet high. The blocks of ice as they broke off crumbled and piled over each other to the accompaniment of a thunderous roar. Throughout the day the pressure continued, the floes alternately opening and closing, and the ship creaking and groaning during the nips between floes. August 4th. For 9 days we have had southerly winds, and the last 4 we have experienced howling blizzards. I am sick of the sound of the infernal wind. Din. 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 And darkness. We should have seen the sun today, but a bank of cumulus effectually hid him, although the daylight is a never-ending joy. August 6, the wind moderated toward 6 a.m. And about breakfast time, with a clear atmosphere, the land from near Cape Cotter to Cape Aurora was visible. What a day of delights! After 4 days of thick weather we find ourselves in sight of Cape Aurora in a position about 45 miles east of Possession Isles. In this time we have been set 100 miles. Good going. Mount Sabine, the first land seen by us when coming south, lies away to the westward, forming the highest peak, 10,000 feet, of a majestic range of mountains covered in eternal snow. Due west we can see the Possession Islands, lying under the stupendous bluff of Cape Downshire, which shows large patches of black rock. The land slopes down to the northwest of Cape Downshire, and rises again into the high peninsula about Cape Adore. We felt excited this morning in anticipation of seeing the sun, which rose about 9:30, local time. It was a glorious, joyful sight. We drank to something, and with very light hearts gave cheers for the sun. August 9, Donnelly got to work on the rudder again. It is a long job cutting through the iron sheathing plates of the rudder, and not too safe at present, as the ice is treacherous. Hook says that the conditions are normal now. I wish for his sake that he could get through. He is a good sportsman and keeps on trying, although, I am convinced, he has little hope with this inadequate aerial. August 10th. The ship's position is lat. 70 degrees 40 minutes south, 40 miles north 29 degrees east of Cape Aurora. The distance drifted from August 2nd to 6th was 100 miles, and from the 6th to the 10th 88 miles. August 12, by observation and bearings of land we are 45 miles northeast of Cape Aurora, in lat. 70 degrees 42 minutes south. This position is a little to the eastward of the position on the 10th. The bearings as laid off on a small-scale chart of mnemonic projection are very inaccurate, and here we are handicapped, as our chronometers have lost all regularity. Donnelly and Grade are having quite a job with the iron platings on the rudder, but should finish the cutting tomorrow. A jury rudder is nearly completed. This afternoon we mixed some concrete for the lower part, and had to use boiling water, as the water froze in the mixing. The carpenter has made a good job of the rudder, although he has had to construct it on the quarterdeck in low temperatures and exposed to biting blasts. August 16th. We are backing and filling about 40 miles northeast of Cape Aurora. This is where we expected to have made much mileage. However, we cannot grumble and must be patient. There was much mirage to the northward, and from the crow's nest a distinct appearance of open water could be seen stretching from north-northwest to northeast. August 17, a glorious day. Land is distinctly visible, and to the northward the black fringe of water sky over the horizon hangs continuously. Hook heard Macquarie Island speaking Hobart. The message heard was the finish of the weather reports. We have hopes now of news in the near future. August 23, saw the land in the vicinity of Cape North. To the south-southwest the white cliffs and peaks of the inland ranges were very distinct, and away in the distance to the southwest could be seen a low stretch of undulating land. At times Mount Sabine was visible through the gloom. The latitude is 69 degrees 44 1/2 s. We are 58 miles north, 40 miles east of Cape North. August 24th. We lifted the rudder out of the ice and placed it clear of the stern, athwart the fore and aft line of the ship. We had quite a job with it, weight, 4.5 tons, using treble, and double-sheaved blocks purchase, but with the endless chain tackle from the engine room, and plenty of beef and leverage. We dragged it clear. All the pintles are gone at the forepart of the rudder. It is a clean break and bears witness to the terrific force exerted on the ship during the nip. I am glad to see the rudder upon the ice and clear of the propeller. The blade itself, which is solid oak and sheathed on 2 sides and after part halfway down, with 3/4-inch iron plating, is undamaged, save for the broken pintles. The twisted portion is in the rudder trunk. August 25, 11 p.m. Hook has just been in with the good tidings that he has heard Macquarie and the Bluff, New Zealand, sending their weather reports and exchanging signals. Can this mean that they have heard our recent signals and are trying to get us now? Our motor has been out of order. August 26. The carpenter has finished the jury rudder and is now at work on the lower end of the rudder truck, where the rudder burst into the stern timbers. We are lucky in having this opportunity to repair these minor damages, which might prove serious in a seaway. August 31, 6:30 a.m., very loud pressure noises to the southeast. I went aloft after breakfast and had the pleasure of seeing many open lanes in all directions. The lanes of yesterday are frozen over, showing what little chance there is of a general and continued breakup of the ice until the temperature rises. Land was visible, but far too distant for even approximate bearings. The berg still hangs to the northwest of the ship. We seem to have pivoted outwards from the land. We cannot get out of this too quickly, and although everyone has plenty of work, and is cheerful, the uselessness of the ship in her present position palls. September 5. The mizzen wireless mast came down in a raging blizzard today. In the forenoon I managed to crawl to windward on the top of the bridge house, and under the lee of the chart house watched the mast bending over with the wind and swaying like the branch of a tree. But after the aerial had stood throughout the winter I hardly thought the mast would carry away. Luckily, as it is dangerous to life to be on deck in this weather, food is brought from the galley in relays through blinding drift and over big heaps of snow. No one was about when the mast carried away. September 8. This is dull, miserable weather. Blow, snow, and calm for an hour or two. Sometimes it blows in this neighborhood without snow and sometimes with. This seems to be the only difference. I have 2 patients now, Larkman and Mugridge. Larkman was frostbitten on the great and second toes of the left foot some time ago, and has so far taken little notice of them. Now they are causing him some alarm as gangrene has set in. Mugridge is suffering from an intermittent rash, with red, inflamed skin and large, short-lived blisters. I don't know what the deuce it is, but the nearest description to it in a materia medica, etc., is pemphigus, so pemphigus it is, and he has been tonic-ed and massaged. September 9. This is the first day for a long time that we have registered a minimum temperature above 0 for the 24 hours. It is pleasant to think that from noon to noon throughout the night the temperature never fell below +4 degrees, 28 degrees frost. And with the increase of daylight it makes one feel that summer really is approaching. September 13, all around the northern horizon there is the appearance of an open water sky, but around the ship the prospect is dreary. The sun rose at 6:20 a.m. and set at 5:25 p.m. Ship's time 11 hours 5 minutes of sunlight and 17 hours light. 3 hours twilight morning and evening. The carpenter is dismantling the taffrail, to facilitate the landing and, if necessary, the boarding of the jury rudder, and will construct a temporary, removable rail. September 16. There has been much mirage all around the horizon, and to the eastward through south to southwest heavy frost smoke has been rising. Over the northern horizon a low bank of white fog hangs as though over the sea. I do not like these continued low temperatures. I am beginning to have doubts as to our release until the sun starts to rot the ice. September 17, this is the anniversary of our departure from London. There are only 4 of the original 11 on board, Larkman, Ninnis, Mauger, and I. Much has happened since Friday, September 18, 1914, and I can recall the scene as we passed down the Thames with submarines and cruisers, in commission and bent on business, crossing our course. I can also remember the regret at leaving it all and the consequent fed-upness. September 21st. The sun is making rapid progress south, and we have had today over 17 hours light and 12 hours sunlight. Oh, for a release! The monotony and worry of our helpless position is deadly. I suppose Shackleton and his party will have started depolaying now and will be full of hopes for the future. I wonder whether the Endurance wintered in the ice or went north. I cannot help thinking that if she wintered in the Weddell Sea she will be worse off than the Aurora. What a lot we have to look for in the next 6 months: news of Shackleton and the Endurance, the party at Cape Evans, and the war. September 22, lat. 69 degrees 12 minutes south, long. 165 degrees 0 minutes east. Sturge Island, Balleny Group, is bearing north, true, 90 miles distant. Light northwest airs with clear, fine weather. Sighted Sturge Island in the morning, bearing due north of us and appearing like a faint low shadow on the horizon. It is good to get a good landmark for fixing positions again, and it is good to see that we are making northerly progress, however small. Since breaking away from Cape Evans we have drifted roughly 705 miles around islands and past formidable obstacles, a wonderful drift. It is good to think that it has not been in vain, and that the knowledge of the set and drill of the pack will be a valuable addition to the sum of human knowledge. The distance from Cape Evans to our present position is 705 miles, geographical. September 27th. The temperature in my room last night was round about 0, rather chilly, but warm enough under the blankets. Hook has dismantled his wireless gear. He feels rather sick about not getting communication, although he does not show it. September 30, Ninnis has been busy now for the week on the construction of a new tractor. He is building the body and will assemble the motor in the fore, between decks, where it can be lashed securely when we are released from the ice. I can see leads of open water from the masthead, but we are still held firmly. How long? October 7th. As time wears on, the possibility of getting back to the barrier to land a party deserves consideration. If we do not get clear until late in the season we will have to turn south first, although we have no anchors and little moorings, no rudder and a short supply of coal. To leave a party on the barrier would make us very short-handed. Still, it can be done, and anything is preferable to the delay in assisting the people at Cape Evans. At 5 a.m. a beautiful parhelion formed around the sun. The sight so impressed the bosun that he roused me out to see it. During the month of October the Aurora drifted uneventfully. Stenhouse mentions that there was often an appearance of open water on the northern and eastern horizon. But anxious eyes were strained in vain for indications that the day of the ship's release was near at hand. Hook had the wireless plant running again and was trying daily to get into touch with Macquarie Island, now about 850 miles distant. The request for a relief ship was to be renewed if communication could be established, for by this time, if all had gone well with the Endurance, the overland party from the Weddell Sea would have been starting. There was considerable movement of the ice towards the end of the month, lanes opening and closing, but the floe, some acres in area, into which the Aurora was frozen, remained firm until the early days of November. The cracks appeared close to the ship, due apparently to heavy drift causing the floe to sink. The temperatures were higher now, under the influence of the sun, and the ice was softer. Thawing was causing discomfort in the quarters aboard. The position on November 12 was reckoned to be lat. 66 degrees 49 minutes south, long. 155 degrees 17 minutes 45 E. Stenhouse made a sounding on November 17, in lat. 66 degrees 40 minutes south, long. 154 degrees 45 minutes east, and found bottom at 194 fathoms. The bottom sample was mud and a few small stones. The sounding line showed a fairly strong undercurrent to the northwest. "We panned out some of the mud," says Stenhouse, "and in the remaining grit found several specks of gold." 2 days later the trend of the current was southeasterly. There was a pronounced thaw on the 22nd. The cabins were in a dripping state, and recently fallen snow was running off the ship in little streams. All hands were delighted, for the present discomfort offered promise of an early breakup of the pack. November 23, at 3 a.m. Young Island, Balleny Group, was seen bearing north 54 degrees east, true. The island, which showed up clearly on the horizon, under a heavy stratus-covered sky, appeared to be very far distant. By latitude at noon we are in 66 degrees 26 minutes south. As this is the charted latitude of Peak Foreman, Young Island, the bearing does not agree. Land was seen at 8 a.m. bearing south 60 degrees west, true. This, which would appear to be Cape Hudson, loomed up through the mists in the form of a high, bold headland, with low undulating land stretching away to the south-southeast and to the westward of it. The appearance of this headland has been foretold for the last 2 days, by masses of black fog, but it seems strange that land so high should not have been seen before, as there is little change in the atmospheric conditions. November 24, overcast and hazy during forenoon. Cloudy, clear, and fine in afternoon and evening. Not a vestige of land can be seen, so Cape Hudson is really Cape Flyaway. This is most weird. All hands saw the headland to the southwest, and some of us sketched it. Now, afternoon, although the sky is beautifully clear to the southwest, nothing can be seen. We cannot have drifted far from yesterday's position. No wonder Wilkes reported land. 9 p.m. A low fringe of land appears on the horizon bearing southwest, but in no way resembles our cape of yesterday. This afternoon we took a cast of the lead through the crack 200 yards west of the ship, but found no bottom at 700 fathoms. An interesting incident on November 26 was the discovery of an emperor penguin rookery. Ninnis and Kavanagh took a long walk to the northwest, and found the deserted rookery. The depressions in the ice, made by the birds, were about 18 inches long and contained a grayish residue. The rookery was in a hollow surrounded by pressure ridges 6 feet high. Apparently about 20 birds had been there. No pieces of eggshell were seen, but the petrels and skuas had been there in force and probably would have taken all scraps of this kind. The floes were becoming soft and rotten, and walking was increasingly difficult. Deep pools of slush and water covered with thin snow made traps for the men. Stenhouse thought that a stiff blizzard would break up the pack. His anxiety was increasing with the advance of the season, and his log is a record of deep yearning to be free and active again. But the grip of the pack was inexorable. The hands had plenty of work on the Aurora, which was being made shipshape after the buffeting of the winter storms. Seals and penguins were seen frequently, and the supply of fresh meat was maintained. The jury rudder was ready to be shipped when the ship was released, but in the meantime it was not being exposed to the attacks of the ice. No appreciable change in our surroundings, was the note for December 17. Every day past now reduces our chance of getting out in time to go north for rudder, anchors, and coal. If we break out before January 15 we might get north to New Zealand and down to Cape Evans again in time to pick up the parties. After that date we can only attempt to go south in our crippled state, and short of fuel. With only 9 days coal on board we would have little chance of working through any Ross Sea pack, or of getting south at all if we encountered many blizzards. Still there is a sporting chance and luck may be with us. Shackleton may be past the pole now. I wish our wireless calls had got through. Christmas Day, with its special dinner and mild festivities, came and passed, and still the ice remained firm. The men were finding some interest in watching the molting of emperor penguins, who were stationed at various points in the neighborhood of the ship. They had taken station to leeward of hummocks, and appeared to move only when the wind changed or the snow around them had become foul. They covered but a few yards on these journeys, and even then stumbled in their weakness. One emperor was brought on board alive, and the crew were greatly amused to see the bird balancing himself on heels and tail, with upturned toes. The position adopted when the egg is resting on the feet during the incubation period. The threat of a stiff blow aroused hopes of release several times, but the blizzard, probably the first Antarctic blizzard that was ever longed for, did not arrive. New Year's Day found Stenhouse and other men just recovering from an attack of snow blindness, contracted by making an excursion across the floes without snow goggles. At the end of the first week in January the ship was in lat. 65 degrees 45 minutes south. The pack was well broken a mile from the ship, and the ice was rolling fast. Under the bows and stern the pools were growing and stretching away in long lanes to the west. A seal came up to blow under the stern on the 6th, proving that there was an opening in the sunken ice there. Stenhouse was economizing in food. No breakfast was served on the ship, and seal or penguin meat was used for at least one of the 2 meals later in the day. All hands were short of clothing, but Stenhouse was keeping intact the sledging gear intended for the use of the shore party. Strong, variable winds on the 9th raised hopes again, and on the morning of the 10th the ice appeared to be well broken from half a mile to a mile distant from the ship in all directions. It seems extraordinary that the ship should be held in an almost unbroken floe of about a mile square, the more so as this patch was completely screwed and broken during the smash in July, and contains many faults. In almost any direction at a distance of half a mile from the ship there are pressure ridges of 8-inch ice piled 20 feet high. It was provident that although so near these ridges were escaped. The middle of January was past and the Aurora lay still in the ice. The period of continuous day was drawing towards its close, and there was an appreciable twilight at midnight. A dark water sky could be seen on the northern horizon. The latitude on January 24 was 65 degrees 39½ foot s. Towards the end of the month Stenhouse ordered a thorough overhaul of the stores and general preparations for a move. The supply of flour and butter was ample. Other stores were running low, and the crew lost no opportunity of capturing seals and penguins. Adelies were traveling to the east-southeast in considerable numbers, but they could not be taken unless they approached the ship closely, owing to the soft condition of the ice. The wireless plant, which had been idle during the months of daylight, had been rigged again, and Hook resumed his calls to Macquarie Island on February 2. He listened in vain for any indication that he had been heard. The pack was showing much movement, but the large floe containing the ship remained firm. The breakup of the floe came on February 12. Strong northeast to southeast winds put the ice in motion and brought a perceptible swell. The ship was making some water, a foretaste of a trouble to come, and all hands spent the day at the pumps, reducing the water from 3 feet 8½ inches in the well to 12 inches. In spite of frozen pipes and other difficulties. Work had just finished for the night when the ice broke astern and quickly split in all directions under the influence of the swell. The men managed to save some seal meat which had been cached in a drift near the gangway. They lost the flagstaff, which had been rigged as a wireless mast out on the floe, but drew in the aerial. The ship was floating now amid fragments of floe, and bumping considerably in the swell. A fresh southerly wind blew during the night, and the ship started to forge ahead gradually without sail. At 8:30 a.m. on the 13th Stenhouse set the foresail and foretopmast staysail, and the Aurora moved northward slowly, being brought up occasionally by large floes. Navigation under such conditions, without steam and without a rudder, was exceedingly difficult, but Stenhouse wished if possible to save his small remaining stock of coal until he cleared the pack, so that a quick run might be made to McMurdo Sound. The jury rudder could not be rigged in the pack. The ship was making about 3½ feet of water in the 24 hours, a quantity easily kept in check by the pumps. During the 14th the Aurora worked very slowly northward through heavy pack. Occasionally the yards were backed or an ice anchor put into a floe to help her out of difficult places, but much of the time she steered herself. The jury rudder boom was topped into position in the afternoon, but the rudder was not to be shipped until open pack or open water was reached. The ship was held up all day on the 15th in lat. 64 degrees 38 minutes south, heavy floes barred progress in every direction. Attempts were made to work the ship by trimming sails and warping with ice anchors, but she could not be maneuvered smartly enough to take advantage of leads that opened and closed. This state of affairs continued throughout the 16th. That night a heavy swell was rolling under the ice and the ship had a rough time. One pointed floe 10 or 12 feet thick was steadily battering, with a 3 feet send, against the starboard side, and fenders only partially deadened the shock. "It is no use butting against this pack with steam power," wrote Stenhouse. "We would use all our meager supply of coal in reaching the limit of the ice in sight, and then we would be in a hole, with neither ballast nor fuel. But if this stagnation lasts another week we will have to raise steam and consume our coal in an endeavor to get into navigable waters. I am afraid our chances of getting south are very small now." The pack remained close, and on the 21st a heavy swell made the situation dangerous. The ship bumped heavily that night and fenders were of little avail. With each send of the swell the ship would bang her bows on the floe ahead, then bounce back and smash into another floe across her stern post. This floe, about 6 feet thick and 100 feet across, was eventually split and smashed by the impacts. The pack was jammed close on the 23rd, when the noon latitude was 64 degrees 36 1/2 foot s. The next change was for the worse. The pack loosened on the night of the 25th, and a heavy northwest swell caused the ship to bump heavily. This state of affairs recurred at intervals in succeeding days. The battering and ramming of the floes increased in the early hours of February 29, until it seemed as if some sharp floe or jagged underfoot must go through the ship's hull. At 6 a.m., we converted a large coir spring into a fender, and slipped it under the port quarter. Where a pressured floe with 20 to 30 feet underfoot was threatening try and knock the propeller and stern post off altogether. At 9 a.m., after pumping ship, the engineer reported a leak in the way of the propeller shaft aft near the stern post on the port side. The carpenter cut part of the lining and filled the space between the timbers with Stockholm tar, cement, and oakum. He could not get at the actual leak, but his makeshift made a little difference. "I am anxious about the propeller. This pack is a dangerous place for a ship now. It seems miraculous that the old barkie still floats." The ice opened out a little on March 1. It was imperative to get the ship out of her dangerous situation quickly, as winter was approaching, and Stenhouse therefore ordered steam to be raised. Next morning he had the spanker gaff rigged over the stern for use as a temporary rudder while in the heavy pack. Steam had been raised to working pressure at 5:15 p.m. on the 2nd, and the Aurora began to work ahead to the westward. Progress was very slow owing to heavy floes and deep underfoots, which necessitated frequent stoppages of the engines. Open water was in sight to the north and northwest the next morning, after a restless night spent among the rocking floes. But progress was very slow. The Aurora went to leeward under the influence of a west-southwest breeze, and steering by means of the yards and a warp anchor was a ticklish business. The ship came to a full stop among heavy floes before noon on the 3rd, and 3 hours later, after vain attempts to warp ahead by means of ice anchors. Stenhouse had the fires partially drawn, to save coal, and banked. No advance was made on March 4 and 5. A moderate gale from the east-northeast closed the ice and set it in motion, and the Aurora, with banked fires, rolled and bumped heavily. 17 bergs were in sight, and one of them was working southwards into the pack and threatening to approach the ship. During the night the engines were turned repeatedly by the action of ice on the propeller blades. "All theories about the swell being non-existent in the pack are false," wrote the anxious master. "Here we are with a suggestion only of open water sky, and the ship rolling her scuppers under and sitting down bodily on the floes." The ice opened when the wind moderated, and on the afternoon of the 6th the Aurora moved northward again. Without a rudder, no jury rudder can yet be used amongst these swirling, rolling floes. The ship requires a lot of attention. Her head must be pointed between floes by means of ice anchors and warps, or by mooring to a floe and steaming round it. We kept a fairly good course between two bergs to our northward and made about 5 miles northing till, darkness coming on, the men could no longer venture on the floes with safety to fix the anchors. The next 3 days were full of anxiety. The Aurora was held by the ice, and subjected to severe buffeting, while 2 bergs approached from the north. On the morning of the 10th the nearest berg was within 3 cables of the ship. But the pack had opened and by 9:30 a.m. the ship was out of the danger zone and headed north-northeast. The pack continued to open during the afternoon, and the Aurora passed through wide stretches of small loose floes and brash. Progress was good until darkness made a stop necessary. The next morning the pack was denser. Stenhouse shipped a preventer jury rudder, the weighted spanker gaff, but could not get steerage way. Broad leads were sighted to the northwest in the afternoon, and the ship got within a quarter of a mile of the nearest lead before being held up by heavy pack. She again bumped severely during the night, and the watch stood by with fenders to ease the more dangerous blows. Early next morning Stenhouse lowered a jury rudder, with steering pennants to drag through the water, and moved north to northwest through heavy pack. He made 16 miles that day on an erratic course, and then spent an anxious night with the ship setting back into the pack and being pounded heavily. Attempts to work forward to an open lead on the morning of the 13th were unsuccessful. Early in the afternoon a little progress was made, with all hands standing by to fend off high ice, and at 4:50 p.m. the Aurora cleared the main pack. An hour was spent shipping the jury rudder under the counter, and then the ship moved slowly northward. There was pack still ahead, and the bergs and growlers were a constant menace in the hours of darkness. Some anxious work remained to be done, since bergs and scattered ice extended in all directions, but at 2 p.m. on March 14 the Aurora cleared the last belt of pack in lat. 62 degrees 27.5 foot s, long. 157 degrees 32 minutes east. We spliced the main brace, says Stenhouse, and blew 3 blasts of farewell to the pack with the whistle. The Aurora was not at the end of her troubles, but the voyage up to New Zealand need not be described in detail. Any attempt to reach McMurdo Sound was now out of the question. Stenhouse had a battered, rudderless ship, with only a few tons of coal left in the bunkers, and he struggled northward in heavy weather against persistent adverse winds and head seas. The jury rudder needed constant nursing, and the shortage of coal made it impossible to get the best service from the engines. There were times when the ship could make no progress and fell about helplessly in a confused swell or lay hove to amid mountainous seas. She was short-handed, and 1 or 2 of the men were creating additional difficulties. But Stenhouse displayed throughout fine seamanship and dogged perseverance. He accomplished successfully one of the most difficult voyages on record, in an ocean area notoriously stormy and treacherous. On March 23 he established wireless communication with Bluff Station, New Zealand, and the next day was in touch with Wellington and Hobart. The naval officer in New Zealand waters offered assistance, and eventually it was arranged that the Otago Harbour Board's tug Plucky should meet the Aurora outside Port Chalmers. There were still bad days to be endured. The jury rudder partially carried away and had to be unshipped in a heavy sea. Stenhouse carried on, and in the early morning of April 2 the Aurora picked up the tug and was taken in tow. She reached Port Chalmers the following morning, and was welcomed with the warm hospitality that New Zealand has always shown towards Antarctic explorers. Chapter 17. The Last Relief. When I reached New Zealand at the beginning of December 1916, I found that the arrangements for the relief were complete. The New Zealand government had taken the task in hand earlier in the year, before I had got into touch with the outside world. The British and Australian governments were giving financial assistance. The Aurora had been repaired and refitted at Port Chalmers during the year at considerable cost, and had been provisioned and coaled for the voyage to McMurdo Sound. My old friend Captain John K. Davis, who was a member of my first Antarctic expedition in 1907, 1909, and who subsequently commanded Dr. Mawson's ship in the Australian Antarctic Expedition had been placed in command of the Aurora by the governments, and he had engaged officers, engineers, and crew. Captain Davis came to Wellington to see me on my arrival there, and I heard his account of the position. I had interviews also with the Minister for Marine, the late Dr. Robert McNabb, a kindly and sympathetic Scotsman who took a deep personal interest in the expedition. Stenhouse also was in Wellington, and I may say again here that his account of his voyage and drift in the Aurora filled me with admiration for his pluck, seamanship, and resourcefulness. After discussing the situation fully with Dr. McNabb, I agreed that the arrangements already made for the relief expedition should stand. Time was important and there were difficulties about making any change of plans or control at the last moment. After Captain Davis had been at work for some months, the government agreed to hand the Aurora over to me free of liability on her return to New Zealand. It was decided, therefore, that Captain Davis should take the ship down to McMurdo Sound, and that I should go with him to take charge of any shore operations that might be necessary. I signed on at a salary of £1 a month, and we sailed from Port Chalmers on December 20, 1916. A week later we sighted ice again. The Aurora made a fairly quick passage through the pack and entered the open water of the Ross Sea on January 7, 1917. Captain Davis brought the Aurora alongside the ice edge off Cape Royds on the morning of January 10. And I went ashore with a party to look for some record in the hut erected there by my expedition in 1907. I found a letter stating that the Ross Sea party was housed at Cape Evans, and was on my way back to the ship when 6 men, with dogs and sledge, were sighted coming from the direction of Cape Evans. At 1 p.m. this party arrived on board, and we learned that of the 10 members of the expedition left behind when the Aurora broke away on May 6, 1915, 7 had survived, namely, Stevens, E. Joyce, H. E. Wild, J. L. Cope, R. W. Richards, A. K. Jack, I. O. Gaze. These 7 men were all well, though they showed traces of the ordeal through which they had passed. They told us of the deaths of McIntosh, Spencer Smith, and Hayward, and of their own anxious wait for relief. All that remained to be done was to make a final search for the bodies of McIntosh and Hayward. There was no possibility of either man being alive. They had been without equipment when the blizzard broke the ice they were crossing. It would have been impossible for them to have survived more than a few days, and 8 months had now elapsed without news of them. Joyce had already searched south of Glacier Tongue. I considered that further search should be made in 2 directions, the area north of Glacier Tongue, and the old depot off Butler Point, and I made a report to Captain Davis to this effect. On January 12 the ship reached a point 5.5 miles east of Butler Point. I took a party across rubbly and waterlogged ice to within 30 yards of the Piedmont ice, but owing to high cliffs and loose slushy ice could not make a landing. The land ice had broken away at the point cut by the cross bearings of the depot, but was visible in the form of 2 large bergs grounded to the north of Cape Bernacchi. There was no sign of the depot or of any person having visited the vicinity. We returned to the ship and proceeded across the sound to Cape Bernacchi. The next day I took a party ashore with the object of searching the area north of Glacier Tongue, including Razorback Island, for traces of the 2 missing men. We reached the Cape Evans hut at 1:30 p.m., and Joyce and I left at 3 p.m. for the Razorbacks. We conducted a search round both islands, returning to the hut at 7 p.m. The search had been fruitless. On the 14th I started with Joyce to search the north side of Glacier Tongue, but the surface drift, with wind from southeast, decided me not to continue. As the ice was moving rapidly at the end of Cape Evans, and the pool between the hut and Inaccessible Island was growing larger. The wind increased in the afternoon. The next day a southeast blizzard was blowing, with drift half up the islands. I considered it unsafe to sledge that day, especially as the ice was breaking away from the south side of Cape Evans into the pool. We spent the day putting the hut in order. We got up at 3 a.m. On the 16th, The weather was fine and calm. I started at 4:20 with Joyce to the south at the greatest possible speed. We reached Glacier Tongue about 1.5 miles from the seaward end. Wherever there were not precipitous cliffs there was an even snow slope to the top. From the top we searched with glasses. There was nothing to be seen but blue ice, crevassed, showing no protuberances. We came down and, half running, half walking, worked about 3 miles towards the root of the glacier. But I could see there was not the slightest chance of finding any remains owing to the enormous snowdrifts wherever the cliffs were accessible. The base of the steep cliffs had drifts 10 to 15 feet high. We arrived back at the hut at 9:40, and left almost immediately for the ship. I considered that all places likely to hold the bodies of McIntosh and Hayward had now been searched. There was no doubt to my mind that they met their deaths on the breaking of the thin ice when the blizzard arose on May 8, 1916. During my absence from the hut Wild and Jack had erected a cross to the memory of the 3 men who had lost their lives in the service of the expedition. Captain Davis took the ship northward on January 17. The ice conditions were unfavorable and pack barred the way. We stood over to the western coast towards Dunlop Island and followed it to Granite Harbor. No mark or depot of any kind was seen. The Aurora reached the main pack, about 60 miles from Cape Audera, on January 22. The ice was closed ahead, and Davis went south in open water to wait for better conditions. A northwest gale on January 28 enabled the ship to pass between the pack and the land off Cape Audera, and we crossed the Antarctic Circle on the last day of the month. On February 4 Davis sent a formal report to the New Zealand government by wireless, and on February 9 the Aurora was berthed at Wellington. We were welcomed like returned brothers by the New Zealand people. Chapter 18. The Final Phase. The foregoing chapters of this book represent the general narrative of our expedition. That we failed in accomplishing the object we set out for was due, I venture to assert, not to any neglect or lack of organization, but to the overwhelming natural obstacles. Especially the unprecedentedly severe summer conditions on the Weddell Sea side. But though the expedition was a failure in one respect, I think it was successful in many others. A large amount of important scientific work was carried out. The meteorological observations in particular have an economic bearing. The hydrographical work in the Weddell Sea has done much to clear up the mystery of this, the least known of all the seas. I have appended a short scientific memorandum to this volume, but the more detailed scientific results must wait until a more suitable time arrives, when more stable conditions prevail. Then results will be worked out. To the credit side of the expedition one can safely say that the comradeship and resource of the members of the expedition was worthy of the highest traditions of polar service. And it was a privilege to me to have had under my command men who, through dark days and the stress and strain of continuous danger, kept up their spirits and carried out their work regardless of themselves and heedless of the limelight. The same energy and endurance that they showed in the Antarctic they brought to the greater war in the Old World. And having followed our fortunes in the South, you may be interested to know that practically every member of the expedition was employed in one or other branches of the active fighting forces during the war. Several are still abroad, and for this very reason it has been impossible for me to obtain certain details for this book. Of the 53 men who returned out of the 56 who left for the South, 3 have since been killed and 5 wounded. 4 decorations have been won, and several members of the expedition have been mentioned in dispatches. McCarthy, the best and most efficient of the sailors, always cheerful under the most trying circumstances, and who for these very reasons I chose to accompany me on the boat journey to South Georgia, was killed at his gun in the Channel. Cheatham, the veteran of the Antarctic, who had been more often south of the Antarctic Circle than any man, was drowned when the vessel he was serving in was torpedoed a few weeks before the armistice. Ernest Wild, Frank Wild's brother, was killed while minesweeping in the Mediterranean. Mauger, the carpenter on the Aurora, was badly wounded while serving with the New Zealand infantry, so that he is unable to follow his trade again. He is now employed by the New Zealand government. The two surgeons, Macklin and McElroy, served in France and Italy, McElroy being badly wounded at Ypres. Frank Wild, in view of his unique experience of ice and ice conditions, was at once sent to the North Russian front, where his zeal and ability won him the highest praise. Macklin served first with the Yorks and later transferred as medical officer to the tanks, where he did much good work. Going to the Italian front with his battalion, he won the Military Cross for bravery in tending wounded under fire. James joined the Royal Engineers, Sound Ranging Section. And after much frontline work was given charge of a sound ranging school to teach other officers this latest and most scientific addition to the art of war. Wardai went to France with the Royal Field Artillery and was badly wounded at Armentières. Hussey was in France for 18 months with the Royal Garrison Artillery, serving in every big battle from Dixmude to St. Quentin. Worsley, known to his intimates as Depth Charge Bill, owing to his success with that particular method of destroying German submarines, has the Distinguished Service Order and 3 submarines to his credit. Stenhouse, who commanded the Aurora after Mackintosh landed, was with Worsley as his second-in-command when one of the German submarines was rammed and sunk, and received the DSC for his share in the fight. He was afterwards given command of a mystery ship, and fought several actions with enemy submarines. Clark served on a minesweeper. Greenstreet was employed with the barges on the Tigris. Rickenson was commissioned as engineer lieutenant. R.N. Kerr returned to the merchant service as an engineer. Most of the crew of the Endurance served on minesweepers. Of the Ross Sea party, Mackintosh, Hayward, and Spencer Smith died for their country as surely as any who gave up their lives on the fields of France and Flanders. Hook, the wireless operator, now navigates an airship. Nearly all of the crew of the Aurora joined the New Zealand Field Forces and saw active service in one or other of the many theaters of war. Several have been wounded, but it has been impossible to obtain details. On my return, after the rescue of the survivors of the Ross Sea party, I offered my services to the government, and was sent on a mission to South America. When this was concluded, I was commissioned as major and went to North Russia in charge of Arctic equipment and transport, having with me Worsley, Stenhouse, Hussey, Macklin, and Brocklehurst, who was to have come south with us, but who, as a regular officer, rejoined his unit on the outbreak of war. He has been wounded 3 times and was in the retreat from Mons. Worsley was sent across to the Archangel front, where he did excellent work, and the others served with me on the Murmansk front. The mobile columns there had exactly the same clothing, equipment, and sledging food as we had on the expedition. No expense was spared to obtain the best of everything for them, and as a result not a single case of avoidable frostbite was reported. Taking the expedition as a unit, out of 56 men 3 died in the Antarctic, 3 were killed in action, and 5 have been wounded, so that our casualties have been fairly high. Though some have gone, there are enough left to rally round and form a nucleus for the next expedition. When troublous times are over and scientific exploration can once more be legitimately undertaken. Appendix. Chapter 1. Scientific Work. By J. M. Wardai, M.A., Cantab, Lieutenant, RFA. The research undertaken by the expedition was originally planned for a shore party working from a fixed base on land. But it was only in South Georgia that this condition of affairs was fully realized. On this island, where a full month was spent, the geologist made very extensive collections, and began the mapping of the country. The magneticien had some of his instruments in working order for a short while, and the meteorologist was able to cooperate with the Argentine observer stationed at Grytviken. It had been realized how important the meteorological observations were going to be to the Argentine government, and they accordingly did all in their power to help, both before and at the end of the expedition. The biologist devoted most of his time, meanwhile, to the whaling industry, there being no less than 7 stations on the island. He also made collections of the neritic fauna, and, accompanied by the photographer, studied the bird life and the habits of the sea elephants along the east coast. By the time the actual southern voyage commenced, each individual had his own particular line of work which he was prepared to follow out. The biologist at first confined himself to collecting the plankton, and a start was made in securing water samples for temperature and salinity. In this, from the beginning, he had the help of the geologist, who also gave instructions for the taking of a line of soundings under the charge of the ship's officers. This period of the southward voyage was a very busy time so far as the scientists were concerned, for, besides their own particular work, they took the full share of looking after the dogs and working the ship watch by watch. At the same time, moreover, the biologist had to try and avoid being too lavish with his preserving material at the expense of the shore station collections which were yet to make. When it was finally known that the ship had no longer any chance of getting free of the ice in the 1914-1915 season, a radical change was made in the arrangements. The scientists were freed, as far as possible, from ship's duties, and were thus able to devote themselves almost entirely to their own particular spheres. The meteorological investigations took on a more definite shape. The instruments intended for the land base were set up on board ship, including self-recording barographs, thermometers, and a Dines anemometer, with which very satisfactory results were got. The physicist set up his quadrant electrometer after a good deal of trouble, but throughout the winter had to struggle constantly with rime forming on the parts of his apparatus exposed to the outer air. Good runs were being thus continually spoilt. The determination of the magnetic constants also took up a good part of his time. Besides collecting plankton, the biologist was now able to put down one or other of his dredges at more frequent intervals, always taking care, however, not to exhaust his store of preserving material, which was limited. The taking of water samples was established on a better system, so that the series should be about equally spaced out over the ship's course. The geologists suppressed all thought of rocks, though occasionally they were met with in-bottom samples. His work became almost entirely oceanographical, and included a study of the sea ice, of the physiography of the sea floor as shown by daily soundings, and of the bottom deposits. Besides this, he helped the biologist in the temperature and salinity observations. The work undertaken and accomplished by each member was as wide as possible. But it was only in keeping with the spirit of the times that more attention should be paid to work from which practical and economic results were likely to accrue. The meteorologist had always in view the effect of Antarctic climate on the other southern continents, the geologist looked on ice from a seaman's point of view. And the biologist not unwillingly put whales in the forefront of his program. The accounts which follow on these very practical points show how closely scientific work in the Antarctica is in touch with, and helps on the economic development of, the inhabited lands to the north. Sea Ice Nomenclature. By J. M. Wardai, M.A., Cantab, Lieutenant, RFA. During the voyage of the Endurance it was soon noticed that the terms being used to describe different forms of ice were not always in agreement with those given in Markham's and Mill's glossary in the Antarctic Manual. 1901. It was the custom, of course, to follow implicitly the terminology used by those of the party whose experience of ice dated back to Captain Scott's first voyage, so that the terms used may be said to be common to all Antarctic voyages of the present century. The principal changes, therefore, in nomenclature must date from the last quarter of the 19th century, when there was no one to pass on the traditional usage from the last naval Arctic expedition in 1875 to the Discovery expedition of 1901. On the latter ship Markham's and Mill's glossary was, of course, used, but apparently not slavishly. Founded, as far as sea ice went, on Scoresby's, made in 1820, it might well have been adopted in its entirety, for no writer could have carried more weight than Scoresby the younger, combining as he did more than 10 years whaling experience with high scientific attainments. Above all others he could be accepted both by practical seamen and also by students of ice forms. That the old terms of Scoresby did not all survive the period of indifference to polar work, in spite of Markham and Mill, is an indication either that their usefulness has ceased or that the original usage has changed once and for all. A restatement of terms is therefore now necessary. Where possible, the actual phrases of Scoresby and of his successors, Markham and Mill, are still used. The principle adopted, however, is to give preference to the words actually used by the polar seamen themselves. The following authorities have been followed as closely as possible. W. Scoresby, June, An Account of the Arctic Regions, 1820, Volume 1, pages 225, 233, 238, 241. C. R. Markham and H. R. Mill in the Antarctic Manual, 1901, pp. 14, 16. J. Payer, New Lands Within the Arctic Circle, 1876, Volume 1, pages 3, 14. W. S. Bruce, Polar Exploration in Home University Library, circa 1911, pages 54, 71. Reference should also be made to the annual publication of the Danish Meteorological Institute showing the Arctic ice conditions of the previous summer. This is published in both Danish and English, so that the terms used there are bound to have a very wide acceptance. It is hoped, therefore, that they may be the means of preventing the Antarctic terminology following a different line of evolution. For but seldom is a seaman found nowadays who knows both polar regions. On the Danish chart 6 different kinds of sea ice are marked, namely, unbroken polar ice, land floe, great ice fields, tight pack ice, open ice, bay ice and brash. With the exception of bay ice, which is more generally known as young ice, all these terms pass current in the Antarctic. Slush or sludge. The initial stages in the freezing of seawater, when its consistency becomes gluey or soupy. The term is also used, but not commonly, for brash ice still further broken down. Pancake ice. Small circular floes with raised rims. Due to the breakup in a gently ruffled sea of the newly formed ice into pieces which strike against each other, and so form turned-up edges. Young ice. Applied to all unhummocked ice up to about a foot in thickness. Owing to the fibrous or platy structure, the floes crack easily, and where the ice is not over thick a ship under steam cuts a passage without much difficulty. Young ice may originate from the coalescence of pancakes, where the water is slightly ruffled, or else be a sheet of black ice, covered maybe with ice flowers, formed by the freezing of a smooth sheet of seawater. In the Arctic it has been the custom to call this form of ice bay ice. In the Antarctic, however, the latter term is wrongly used for land floes, fast ice, etc. and has been so misapplied consistently for 15 years. The term bay ice should possibly, therefore, be dropped altogether, especially since, even in the Arctic, its meaning is not altogether a rigid one, as it may denote firstly the gluey slush, which forms when seawater freezes, and secondly the firm level sheet ultimately produced. Land floes. Heavy but not necessarily hummocked ice, with generally a deep snow covering, which has remained held up in the position of growth by the enclosing nature of some feature of the coast, or by grounded bergs throughout the summer season when most of the ice breaks out. Its thickness is, therefore, above the average. Has been called at various times fast ice, coast ice, land ice, bay ice, by Shackleton and David and the Charcot Expedition. And possibly what Drygalski calls skelfies is not very different. Floe. An area of ice, level or hummocked, whose limits are within sight. Includes all sizes between brash on the one hand and fields on the other. Light floes are between 1 and 2 feet in thickness, anything thinner being young ice. Those exceeding 2 feet in thickness are termed heavy floes, being generally hummocked, and in the Antarctic, at any rate, covered by fairly deep snow. Field. A sheet of ice of such extent that its limits cannot be seen from the masthead. Hummocking. Includes all the processes of pressure formation whereby level young ice becomes broken up and built up into hummocky floes. The most suitable term for what has also been called old pack and screwed pack by David and Scholenize by German writers. In contrast to young ice, the structure is no longer fibrous, but becomes spotted or bubbly, a certain percentage of salt drains away, and the ice becomes almost translucent. The pack. A term very often used in a wide sense to include any area of sea ice, no matter what form it takes or how disposed. The French term is banquise de derive. Pack ice. A more restricted use than the above, to include hummocky flows or close areas of young ice and light flows. Pack ice is close or tight if the flows constituting it are in contact, open if, for the most part, they do not touch. In both cases it hinders, but does not necessarily check, navigation. The contrary holds for drift ice. Loose open ice, where the area of water exceeds that of ice. Generally drift ice is within reach of the swell, and is a stage in the breaking down of pack ice, the size of the flows being much smaller than in the latter. Scoresby's use of the term drift ice for pieces of ice intermediate in size between floes and brash has, however, quite died out. The Antarctic or Arctic pack usually has a girdle or fringe of drift ice. Brash. Small fragments and roundish nodules, the wreck of other kinds of ice. Bergy bits. Pieces, about the size of a cottage, of glacier ice or of hummocky pack washed clear of snow. Growlers. Still smaller pieces of sea ice than the above, greenish in color, and barely showing above water level. Crack. Any sort of fracture or rift in the sea ice covering. Lead or lane. Where a crack opens out to such a width as to be navigable. In the Antarctic it is customary to speak of these as leads, even when frozen over to constitute areas of young ice. Pools. Any enclosed water areas in the pack, where length and breadth are about equal. Meteorology. By L. D. Hussey, B.Sc., London, Captain RGA. The meteorological results of the expedition, when properly worked out and correlated with those from other stations in the southern hemisphere, will be extremely valuable. Both for their bearing on the science of meteorology in general, and for their practical and economic applications. South America is, perhaps, more intimately concerned than any other country, but Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa are all affected by the weather conditions of the Antarctic. Researches are now being carried on which tend to show that the meteorology of the two hemispheres is more interdependent than was hitherto believed. So that a meteorological disturbance in one part of the world makes its presence felt, more or less remotely perhaps, all over the world. It is evident, therefore, that a complete knowledge of the weather conditions in any part of the world, which it is understood carries with it the ability to make correct forecasts, can never be obtained unless the weather conditions in every other part are known. This makes the need for purely scientific polar expeditions so imperative, since our present knowledge of Arctic and Antarctic meteorology is very meager, and to a certain extent unsystematic. What is wanted is a chain of observing stations well equipped with instruments and trained observers stretching across the Antarctic continent. A series of exploring ships could supplement these observations with others made by them while cruising in the Antarctic seas. It would pay to do this, even for the benefit accruing to farmers, sailors, and others who are so dependent on the weather. As an instance of the value of a knowledge of Antarctic weather conditions, it may be mentioned that, as the result of observations and researches carried out at the South Orkneys, a group of subantarctic islands at the entrance to the Weddell Sea, it has been found that a cold winter in that sea is a sure precursor of a drought over the maize and cereal-bearing area of Argentina 3.5 years later. To the farmers, the value of this knowledge so far in advance is enormous, and since England has some £300 million invested in Argentine interests, Antarctic expeditions have proved, and will prove, their worth even from a purely commercial point of view. I have given just this one instance to satisfy those who question the utility of polar expeditions, but many more could be cited. As soon as it was apparent that no landing could be made, and that we should have to spend a winter in the ship drifting round with the pack, instruments were set up and observations taken just as if we had been ashore. A meteorological screen or box was erected on a platform over the stern, right away from the living quarters, and in it were placed the maximum and minimum thermometers, the recording barograph, and thermograph, an instrument which writes every variation of the temperature and pressure on a sheet of paper on a revolving drum, and the standard thermometer. A very carefully manufactured thermometer, with all its errors determined and tabulated. The other thermometers were all checked from this one. On top of the screen a Robinson's anemometer was screwed. This consisted of an upright rod, to the top of which were pivoted 4 arms free to revolve in a plane at right angles to it. At the end of these arms hemispherical cups were screwed. These were caught by the wind and the arms revolved at a speed varying with the force of the wind. The speed of the wind could be read off on a dial below the arms. In addition there was an instrument called a Dines anemometer which supplied interesting tracings of the force, duration, and direction of the wind. There was an added advantage in the fact that the drum on which these results were recorded was comfortably housed down below, so that one could sit in a comparatively warm room and follow all the varying phases of the blizzard which was raging without. The barometer used was of the Q standard pattern. When the ship was crushed, all the monthly records were saved, but the detailed tracings, which had been packed up in the hold, were lost. Though interesting, they were not really essential. Continuous observations were made during the long drift on the floe, and while on Elephant Island the temperature was taken at midday each day as long as the thermometers lasted. The mortality amongst these instruments, especially those which were tied to string and swung round, was very high. A few extracts from the observations taken during 1915, the series for that year being practically complete, may be of interest. January was dull and overcast, only 7% of the observations recording a clear blue sky, 71% being completely overcast. The percentage of clear sky increased steadily up till June and July, these months showing respectively 42% and 45.7%. In August 40% of the observations were clear sky, while September showed a sudden drop to 27%. October weather was much the same, and November was practically overcast the whole time, clear sky showing at only 8% of the observations. In December the sky was completely overcast for nearly 90% of the time. Temperatures on the whole were fairly high, though a sudden unexpected drop in February, after a series of heavy northeasterly gales, caused the ship to be frozen in, and effectually put an end to any hopes of landing that year. The lowest temperature experienced was in July, when -35 degrees Fahrenheit, i.e. 67 degrees below freezing, was reached. Fortunately, as the sea was one mass of consolidated pack, the air was dry, and many days of fine bright sunshine occurred. Later on, as the pack drifted northwards and broke up, wide lanes of water were formed, causing fogs and mist and dull overcast weather generally. In short, it may be said that in the Weddell Sea the best weather comes in winter. Unfortunately, during that season the sun also disappears, so that one cannot enjoy it as much as one would like. As a rule, too, southerly winds brought fine clear weather, with marked fall in the temperature, and those from the north were accompanied by mist, fog, and overcast skies, with comparatively high temperatures. In the Antarctica, a temperature of 30 degrees, i.e. 2 degrees below freezing, is considered unbearably hot. The greatest difficulty that was experienced was due to the accumulation of rime on the instruments. In low temperatures everything became covered with ice crystals, deposited from the air, which eventually grew into huge blocks. Sometimes these blocks became dislodged and fell, making it dangerous to walk along the decks. The rime collected on the thermometers, the glass bowl of the sunshine recorder, and the bearings of the anemometer, necessitating the frequent use of a brush to remove it, and sometimes effectively preventing the instruments from recording at all. One of our worst blizzards occurred on August 1, 1915, which was, for the ship, the beginning of the end. It lasted for 4 days, with cloudy and overcast weather for the 3 following days, and from that time onwards we enjoyed very little sun. The weather that we experienced on Elephant Island can only be described as appalling. Situated as we were at the mouth of a gully, down which a huge glacier was slowly moving, with the open sea in front and to the left, and towering, snow-covered mountains on our right. The air was hardly ever free from snowdrift, and the winds increased to terrific violence through being forced over the glacier and through the narrow gully. Huge blocks of ice were hurled about like pebbles, and cases of clothing and cooking utensils were whisked out of our hands and carried away to sea. For the first fortnight after our landing there, the gale blew, at times, at over 100 miles an hour. Fortunately it never again quite reached that intensity, but on several occasions violent squalls made us very fearful for the safety of our hut. The island was almost continuously covered with a pall of fog and snow, clear weather obtaining occasionally when pack ice surrounded us. Fortunately a series of southwesterly gales had blown all the ice away to the northeast 2 days before the rescue ship arrived, leaving a comparatively clear sea for her to approach the island. Being one solitary moving station in the vast expanse of the Weddell Sea, with no knowledge of what was happening anywhere around us, forecasting was very difficult and at times impossible. Great assistance in this direction was afforded by copies of Mr. R. C. Mossman's researches and papers on Antarctic meteorology, which he kindly supplied to us. I have tried to make this very brief account of the meteorological side of the expedition rather more popular than scientific, since the publication and scientific discussion of the observations will be carried out elsewhere. But if, while showing the difficulties under which we had to work, it emphasizes the value of Antarctic expeditions from a purely utilitarian point of view, and the need for further continuous research into the conditions obtaining in the immediate neighborhood of the pole, it will have achieved its object. Physics. R. W. James, M.A., Cantab, B.Sc., London, Captain R.E. Owing to the continued drift of the ship with the ice, the program of physical observations originally made out had to be considerably modified. It had been intended to set up recording magnetic instruments at the base, and to take a continuous series of records throughout the whole period of residence there. Absolute measurements of the Earth's horizontal magnetic force, of the dip and declination being taken at frequent intervals for purposes of calibration. With the ice continually drifting, and the possibility of the floe cracking at any time, it proved impracticable to set up the recording instruments. And the magnetic observations were confined to a series of absolute measurements taken whenever opportunity occurred. These measurements, owing to the drift of the ship, extend over a considerable distance, and give a chain of values along a line stretching, roughly from 77 degrees south, lat. to 69 degrees south, lat. This is not the place to give the actual results. It is quite enough to state that, as might have been expected from the position of the magnetic pole, the values obtained correspond to a comparatively low magnetic latitude. The value of the dip ranging from 63 degrees to 68 degrees. So far as possible, continuous records of the electric potential gradient in the atmosphere were taken, a form of quadrant electrometer with a boom and ink recorder, made by the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company, being employed. Here again, the somewhat peculiar conditions made work difficult, as the instrument was very susceptible to small changes of level, such as occurred from time to time owing to the pressure of the ice on the ship. An ionium collector, for which the radioactive material was kindly supplied by Mr. F. H. Glue, was used. The chief difficulty to contend with was the constant formation of thick deposits of rime, which either grew over the insulation and spoiled it, or covered up the collector so that it could no longer act. Nevertheless, a considerable number of good records were obtained, which have not yet been properly worked out. Conditions during the expedition were very favorable for observations on the physical properties and natural history of sea ice, and a considerable number of results were obtained, which are, however, discussed elsewhere, mention of them being made here since they really come under the heading of physics. In addition to these main lines of work, many observations of a miscellaneous character were made, including those on the occurrence and nature of parhelia or mock suns, which were very common, and generally finely developed, and observations of the auroral displays, which were few and rather poor owing to the comparatively low magnetic latitude. Since most of the observations made are of little value without a knowledge of the place where they were made, and since a very complete set of soundings were also taken, the daily determination of the ship's position was a matter of some importance. The drift of the ship throws considerable light on at least one geographical problem, that of the existence of Morel Land. The remainder of this appendix will therefore be devoted to a discussion of the methods used to determine the positions of the ship from day to day. The latitude and longitude were determined astronomically every day when the sun or stars were visible. The position thus determined serving as the fixed points between which the position on days when the sky was overcast could be interpolated by the process known as dead reckoning, that is to say, by estimating the speed and course of the ship, taking into account the various causes affecting it. The sky was often overcast for several days at a stretch, and it was worth while to take a certain amount of care in the matter. Captain Worsley constructed an apparatus which gave a good idea of the direction of drift at any time. This consisted of an iron rod, which passed through an iron tube, frozen vertically into the ice, into the water below. At the lower end of the rod, in the water, was a vane. The rod being free to turn, the vane took up the direction of the current, the direction being shown by an indicator attached to the top of the rod. The direction shown depended, of course, on the drift of the ice relative to the water, and did not take into account any actual current which may have been carrying the ice with it. But the true current seems never to have been large, and the direction of the vane probably gave fairly accurately the direction of the drift of the ice. No exact idea of the rate of drift could be obtained from the apparatus, although one could get an estimate of it by displacing the vane from its position of rest and noticing how quickly it returned to it, the speed of return being greater the more rapid the drift. Another means of estimating the speed and direction of the drift was from the trend of the wire when a sounding was being taken. The rate and direction of drift appeared to depend almost entirely on the wind velocity and direction at the time. If any true current effect existed, it is not obvious from a rough comparison of the drift with the prevailing wind. But a closer investigation of the figures may show some outstanding effect due to current. 1. The drift was always to the left of the actual wind direction. This effect is due to the rotation of the Earth, a corresponding deviation to the right of the wind direction being noted by Nansen during the drift of the Fram. A change in the direction of the wind was often preceded by some hours by a change in the reading of the drift vane. This is no doubt due to the ice to windward being set in motion, the resulting disturbance traveling through the ice more rapidly than the approaching wind. For the astronomical observations either the sextant or a theodolite was used. The theodolite employed was a light 3-vernier instrument by Carey Porter, intended for sledging work. This instrument was fairly satisfactory, although possibly rigidity had been sacrificed to lightness to rather too great an extent. Another point which appears worth mentioning is the following: the foot screws were of brass, the tribrac, into which they fitted, was made of aluminium for the sake of lightness. The two metals have a different coefficient of expansion, and while the feet fitted the tribrac at ordinary temperatures, they were quite loose at temperatures in the region of 20 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. In any instrument designed for use at low temperatures, care should be taken that parts which have to fit together are made of the same material. For determining the position in drifting pack ice, the theodolite proved to be a more generally useful instrument than the sextant. The ice flows are quite steady in really thick pack ice, and the theodolite can be set up and leveled as well as on dry land. The observations, both for latitude and longitude, consist in measuring altitude of the sun or of a star. The chief uncertainty in this measurement is that introduced by the refraction of light by the air. At very low temperatures, the correction to be applied on this account is uncertain, and, if possible, observations should always be made in pairs with a north star and a south star for a latitude, and an east star and a west star for a longitude. The refraction error will then usually mean out. This error affects observations both with the theodolite and the sextant, but in the case of the sextant another cause of error occurs. In using the sextant, the angle between the heavenly body and the visible horizon is measured directly. Even in dense pack ice, if the observations are taken from the deck of the ship or from a hummock or a low berg, the apparent horizon is usually sharp enough for the purpose. In very cold weather, however, and particularly if there are open leads and pools between the observer and the horizon, there is frequently a great deal of mirage. And the visible horizon may be miraged up several minutes. This will reduce the altitude observed, and corrections on this account are practically impossible to apply. This error may be counterbalanced to some extent by pairing observations as described above, but it by no means follows that the mirage effect will be the same in the two directions. Then again, during the summer months, no stars will be visible, and observations for latitude will have to depend on a single noon sight of the sun. If the sun is visible at midnight, its altitude will be too low for accurate observations, and in any case atmospheric conditions will be quite different from those prevailing at noon. In the Antarctic, therefore, conditions are peculiarly difficult for getting really accurate observations. And it is necessary to reduce the probability of error in a single observation as much as possible. When possible, observations of the altitude of a star or of the sun should be taken with the theodolite, since the altitude is referred to the spirit level of the instrument, and is independent of any apparent horizon. During the drift of the Endurance, both means of observation were generally employed. A comparison of the results showed an agreement between sextant and theodolite, within the errors of the instrument if the temperature was above about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. At lower temperatures there were frequently discrepancies which could generally be attributed to the mirage effects described above. As the Endurance was carried by the ice drift well to the west of the Weddell Sea, towards the position of the supposed Morel land, the accurate determination of longitude became a matter of moment in view of the controversy as to the existence of this land. During a long voyage, latitude can always be determined with about the same accuracy, the accuracy merely depending on the closeness with which altitudes can be measured. In the case of longitude, matters are rather different. The usual method employed consists in the determination of the local time by astronomical observations, and the comparison of this time with Greenwich time, as shown by the ship's chronometer. An accurate knowledge of the errors and rate of the chronometer being required. During the voyage of the Endurance about 15 months elapsed during which no check on the chronometers could be obtained by the observation of known land. And had no other check been applied, there would have been the probability of large errors in the longitudes. For the purpose of checking the chronometers, a number of observations of occultations were observed during the winter of 1915. An occultation is really the eclipse of a star by the moon. A number of such eclipses occur monthly, and are tabulated in the Nautical Almanac. From the data given there, it is possible to compute the Greenwich time at which the phenomenon ought to occur for an observer situated at any place on the Earth, provided his position is known within a few miles, which will always be the case. The time of disappearance of the star by the chronometer to be corrected is noted. The actual Greenwich time of the occurrence is calculated, and the error of the chronometer is thus determined. With ordinary care the chronometer error can be determined in this way to within a few seconds, which is accurate enough for purposes of navigation. The principal difficulties of this method lie in the fact that comparatively few occultations occur, and those which do occur are usually of stars of the 5th magnitude or lower. In the Antarctic, conditions for observing occultation are rather favorable during the winter, since 5th magnitude stars can be seen with a small telescope at any time during the 24 hours if the sky is clear. And the moon is also often above the horizon for a large fraction of the time. In the summer, however, the method is quite impossible, since, for some months, stars are not to be seen. No chronometer check could be applied until June 1915. On June 24 a series of 4 occultations were observed, and the results of the observations showed an error in longitude of a whole degree. In July, August, and September further occultations were observed, and a fairly reliable rate was worked out for the chronometers and watches. After the crushing of the ship on October 27, 1915, no further occultations were observed, but the calculated rates for the watches were employed, and the longitude deduced. Using these rates on March 23, 1916, was only about 10 foot of arc in error, judging by the observations of Joinville land made on that day. It is thus fairly certain that no large error can have been made in the determination of the position of the Endurance at any time during the drift. And her course can be taken as known with greater certainty than is usually the case in a voyage of such length. South Atlantic Whales and Whaling. By Robert S. Clark, M.A., B.Sc., Lieutenant, RNVR. Modern whaling methods were introduced into subantarctic seas in 1904, and operations commenced in the following year at South Georgia. So successful was the initial venture that several companies were floated, and the fishing area was extended to the South Shetlands, the South Orkneys, and as far as 67 degrees south. Along the western coast of Graham Land. This area lies within the dependencies of the Falkland Islands, and is under the control of the British government. And its geographical position offers exceptional opportunities for the successful prosecution of the industry by providing a sufficient number of safe anchorages and widely separated islands, where shore stations have been established. The dependencies of the Falkland Islands lie roughly within latitude 50 degrees and 65 degrees south, and longitude 25 degrees and 70 degrees west. And include the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, South Sandwich, South Orkney, and South Shetland Islands, and part of Graham Land. The industry is prosperous, and the products always find a ready market. In this subantarctic area alone, the resulting products more than doubled the world supply. The total value of the Falkland Island dependencies in 1913 amounted to £1,252,432, in 1914 to £1,300,978, in 1915 to £1,333,401, and in 1916 to £1,774,570. This has resulted chiefly from the marketing of whale oil and the byproduct, guano, and represents for each total a season's capture of several thousand whales. In 1916, the number of whales captured in this area was 11,860, which included 6,000 for South Georgia alone. Whale oil, which is now the product of most economic value in the whaling industry, is produced in 4 grades, some companies adding a 5th. These are NOS 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which in 1913 sold at 24 pounds, 22 pounds, 20 pounds, and 18 pounds respectively per ton, net weight, barrels included, there are 6 barrels to a ton. The 1919 prices have increased to 72 pounds tens per ton, barrels included, less 2.5%. 68 pounds per ton, barrels included, less 2.5%. 65 pounds per ton, barrels included, less 2.5%. 63 pounds per ton, barrels included, less 2.5%. Whale oil can be readily transformed into glycerin. It is used in the manufacture of soap, and quite recently, both in this country and in Norway. It has been refined by means of a simple hardening process into a highly palatable and nutritious margarine. Wartime conditions emphasized the importance of the whale oil. And fortunately the supply was fairly constant for the production of the enormous quantities of glycerin required by the country in the manufacture of explosives. In relation to the food supply, it was no less important in saving the country from a fat famine, when the country was confronted with the shortage of vegetable and other animal oils. The production of guano, bone meal, and flesh meal may pay off the running expenses of a whaling station, but their value lies, perhaps, more in their individual properties. Flesh meal makes up into cattle cake, which forms an excellent fattening food for cattle, while bone meal and guano are very effective fertilizers. Guano is the meat, generally the residue of distillation, which goes through a process of drying and disintegration, and is mixed with the crushed bone in the proportion of 2 parts flesh to 1 part bone. This is done chiefly at the shore stations, and, to a less extent on floating factories, though so far on the latter it has not proved very profitable. Whale flesh, though slightly greasy perhaps and of strong flavor, is quite palatable, and at South Georgia, it made a welcome addition to our bill of fare, the flesh of the humpback being used. A large supply of whale flesh was shipped as food for the dogs on the journey south, and this was eaten ravenously. It is interesting to note also the successful rearing of pigs at South Georgia, chiefly, if not entirely, on the whale products. The whalebone or baleen plates, which at one time formed the most valuable article of the Arctic fishery, may here be regarded as of secondary importance. The baleen plates of the southern right whale reach only a length of about 7 feet, and have been valued at £750 per ton, but the number of these whales captured is very small indeed. In the case of the other whalebone whales, the baleen plates are much smaller and of inferior quality, the baleen of the sei whale probably excepted, and this only makes about £85 per ton. Sperm whales have been taken at South Georgia and the South Shetlands, but never in any quantity, being more numerous in warmer areas. The products and their value are too well known to be repeated. The Endurance reached South Georgia on November 5, 1914, and anchored in King Edward Cove, Cumberland Bay, off Grytviken, the shore station of the Argentina Pesca Company. During the month's stay at the island a considerable amount of time was devoted to a study of the whales and the whaling industry, in the intervals of the general routine of expedition work, and simultaneously with other studies on the general life of this interesting subantarctic island. Visits were made to 6 of the 7 existing stations, observations were made on the whales landed, and useful insight was gathered as to the general working of the industry. From South Georgia the track of the Endurance lay in a direct line to the South Sandwich Group, between Saunders and Candlemas Islands. Then southeasterly and southerly courses were steered to the Coates Land Barrier, along which we steamed for a few hundred miles until forced westward, when we were unfortunately held up in about lat. 76 degrees 34 minutes south, and long. 37 degrees 30 minutes west on January 19, 1915, by enormous masses of heavy pack ice. The ship drifted to lat. 76 degrees 59 minutes south, long. 37 degrees 47 minutes west. On March 19, 1915, and then west and north until crushed in lat. 69 degrees 5 minutes south and long. 51 degrees 30 minutes west on October 26, 1915. We continued drifting gradually north, afloat on ice floes, past Graham Land and Joinville Island, and finally took to the boats on April 9, 1916, and reached Elephant Island on April 15. The Falkland Island dependencies were thus practically circumnavigated. And it may be interesting to compare the records of whales seen in the region outside and to the south of this area with the records and the percentage of each species captured in the intensive fishing area. The most productive part of the South Atlantic lies south of latitude 50 degrees south, where active operations extend to and even beyond the Antarctic Circle. It appears to be the general rule in Antarctic waters that whales are more numerous the closer the association with ice conditions. And there seems to be reasonable grounds for supposing that this may explain the comparatively few whales sighted by expeditions which have explored the more northerly and more open seas. While the whalers themselves have even asserted that their poor seasons have nearly always coincided with the absence of ice, or with poor ice conditions. At all events, those expeditions which have penetrated far south and well into the pack ice have, without exception, reported the presence of whales in large numbers. Even in the farthest south latitudes, so that our knowledge of the occurrence of whales in the Antarctic has been largely derived from these expeditions, whose main object was either the discovery of new land or the pole itself. The largest number of Antarctic expeditions has concentrated on the 2 areas of the South Atlantic and the Ross Sea, and the records of the occurrences of whales have, in consequence, been concentrated in these 2 localities. In the intervening areas, however, expeditions, notably the Belgica on the western side and the Gauss on the eastern side of the Antarctic continent, have reported whales in moderately large numbers. So that the stock is by no means confined to the two areas above mentioned. The effective fishing area may be assumed to lie within a radius of 100 miles from each shore station and floating factory anchorage. And a rough estimate of all the Falkland stations works out at 160,000 square miles. The total for the whole Falkland area is about 2 million square miles, which is roughly less than a sixth of the total Antarctic Sea area. The question then arises as to how far the catch percentage during the short fishing season affects the total stock. But so far one can only conjecture as to the actual results from a comparison of the numbers seen, chiefly by scientific and other expeditions, in areas outside the intensive fishing area with the numbers and percentage of each species captured in the intensive fishing area. Sufficient evidence, however, seems to point quite definitely to one species, the humpback, being in danger of extermination. But the blue and fin whales, the other two species of rorquals which form the bulk of the captures, appear to be as frequent now as they have ever been. The whales captured at the various whaling stations of the Falkland area are confined largely to three species: blue whale, Balænoptera musculus, fin whale, Balænoptera physalis, and humpback, Megaptera nodosa. Sperm whales, Physeter catodon, and right whales, Balena glacialis, being only occasional and rare captures. While the sei whale, Balænoptera borealis, appeared in the captures at South Georgia in 1913, and now forms a large percentage of the captures at the Falkland Islands. During the earlier years of whaling at South Georgia, and up to the fishing season 1910-11, humpbacks formed practically the total catch. In 1912-13 the following were the percentages for the three rorquals in the captures at South Georgia and South Shetlands. Humpback 38%, fin whale 36%, blue whale 20%. Of late years the percentages have altered considerably, blue whales and fin whales predominating, humpbacks decreasing rapidly. In 1915, the South Georgia Whaling Company, Messrs. Salveson, Leith, captured 1085 whales, consisting of 15% humpback, 25% fin whales, 58% blue whales, and 2 right whales. In the same year the captures of 3 companies at the South Shetlands gave 1512 whales, and the percentages worked out at 12% humpbacks, 42% fin whales, and 45% blue whales. In 1919, the Southern Whaling and Sealing Company captured, at Stromness, South Georgia, 529 whales, of which 2% were humpbacks, 51% fin whales, and 45% blue whales. These captures do not represent the total catch, but are sufficiently reliable to show how the species are affected. The reduction in numbers of the humpback is very noticeable, and even allowing for the possible increase in size of gear for the capture of the larger and more lucrative blue and fin whales. There is sufficient evidence to warrant the fears that the humpback stock is threatened with extinction. In the immediate northern areas, in the region from latitude 50 degrees south northward to the equator, which is regarded as next in importance quantitatively to the sub-Antarctic, though nothing like being so productive, the captures are useful for a comparative study in distribution. At Saldana Bay, Cape Colony, in 1912, 131 whales were captured and the percentages were as follows: 35% humpback, 13% fin whale, 4% blue whale, 46% sei whale. While nearer the equator, at Port Alexander, the total capture was 322 whales, and the percentages gave 98% humpback, and only 2 captures each of fin and sei whales. In 1914, at South Africa, chiefly Saldana Bay in Durban, out of a total of 839 whales 60% were humpback, 25% fin whales, and 13% blue whales. In 1916, out of a total of 853 whales 10% were humpback, 13% fin whales, 6% blue whales, 68% sperm whales, and 1% sei whales. In Chilean waters, in 1916, a total of 327 whales gave 31% humpbacks, 24% fin whales, 26% blue whales, 12% sperm whales, and 5 right whales. There seems then to be a definite interrelation between the two areas. The same species of whales are captured, and the periods of capture alternate with perfect regularity. The fishing season occurring from the end of November to April in the subantarctic and from May to November in the subtropics. A few of the companies, however, carry on operations to a limited extent at South Georgia and at the Falkland Islands during the southern winter. But the fishing is by no means a profitable undertaking, though proving the presence of whales in this area during the winter months. The migrations of whales are influenced by two causes. 1. The distribution of their food supply. 2. The position of their breeding grounds. In the Antarctic, during the summer months, there is present in the sea an abundance of plant and animal life, and whales which feed on the small plankton organisms are correspondingly numerous. But in winter this state of things is reversed, and whales are poorly represented or absent, at least in the higher latitudes. During the drift of the endurance samples of plankton were taken almost daily during an Antarctic summer and winter. From December to March, a few minutes' haul of a tow net at the surface was sufficient to choke up the meshes with the plant and animal life. But this abundance of surface life broke off abruptly in April, and subsequent hauls contained very small organisms until the return of daylight and the opening up of the pack ice. The lower water strata, down to about 100 fathoms, were only a little more productive, and euphausiae were taken in the hauls, though sparingly. During the winter spent at Elephant Island, our total catch of genta penguins amounted to 1,436 for the period April 15 to August 30, 1916. All these birds were cut up, the livers and hearts were extracted for food, and the skins were used as fuel. At the same time the stomachs were invariably examined, and a record kept of the contents. The largest proportion of these contained the small crustacean euphausia, and this generally to the exclusion of other forms. Occasionally, however, small fish were recorded. The quantity of euphausiae present in most of the stomachs was enormous for the size of the birds. These penguins were migrating, and came ashore only when the bays were clear of ice. As there were several periods of 14 consecutive days when the bays and the surrounding sea were covered over with a thick compact mass of ice floes, and then penguins were entirely absent. Euphausiae, then, seemed to be present in sufficient quantity in certain, if not in all, subantarctic waters during the southern winter. We may assume then that the migration to the south, during the Antarctic summer, is definitely in search of food. Observations have proved the existence of a northern migration, and it seems highly improbable that this should also be in search of food, but rather for breeding purposes. And it seems that the whales select the more temperate regions for the bringing forth of their young. This view is strengthened by the statistical fetal records, which show the pairing takes place in the northern areas. That the fetus is carried by the mother during the southern migration to the Antarctic, and that the calves are born in the more congenial waters north of the subantarctic area. We have still to prove, however, the possibility of a circumpolar migration, and we are quite in the dark as to the number of whales that remain in subantarctic areas during the southern winter. The following is a rough classification of whales, with special reference to those known to occur in the South Atlantic. 1. Whalebone whales, Mysticoceti. Right whales. Balenidae. Rorquals. Balanopteridae. Southern right whale. Balena glacialis. Finner whales, Balanoptera. Humpback. Megaptera nodosa. Blue whale, B. musculus. Fin whale, B. physalis. Sei whale, B. borealis. Piked whale, B. acutorostrata. Bride's whale, B. bridii. 2. Toothed whales, Odontoceti. Sperm whale. Physeter catodon. Beaked whales, including bottlenose whales. Hyperoodon rostratus. Dolphins. 1. Killer. Orcinus. Orca. 2. Black fish. Globicephalus malas. 3. Porpoises. Laginarhynchus sp. The subdivision of whalebone whales is one of degree in the size of the whalebone. These whales have enormously muscular tongues, which press the water through the whalebone lamellae and thus, by a filtering process, retain the small food organisms. The food of the whalebone whales is largely the small crustacea which occur in the plankton, though some whales, humpback, fin whales, and sei whales, feed also on fish. The stomachs examined at South Georgia during December 1914, belong to the three species, humpbacks, fin whales, and blue whales, and all contained small crustacea, Euphausiae, with a mixture of amphipods. The toothed whales, sperms and bottlenoses, are known to live on squids. And that there is an abundance of this type of food in the Weddell Sea was proved by an examination of penguin and seal stomachs. Emperor penguins, and hundreds of these were examined, were invariably found to contain cephalopod beaks, while large, partly digested squids were often observed in Weddell seals. A dorsal fin is present in the rorquals but absent in right whales. With other characters, notably the size of the animal, it serves as a ready mark of identification, but is occasionally confusing owing to the variation in shape in some of the species. With the exception of several schools of porpoises, very few whales were seen during the outward voyage. Not till we approached the Falkland area did they appear in any numbers. For small schools of fin whales and a few humpbacks were sighted on October 28 and 29, 1914, in lat. 38 degrees 1 minute south, long. 55 degrees 3 minutes west and in lat. 40 degrees 35 minutes south, long. 53 degrees 11 minutes west. While Globicephalus malas was seen only once, in lat. 45 degrees 17 minutes south, long. 48 degrees 58 minutes west, on October 31, 1914. At South Georgia, the whales captured at the various stations in December 1914, were blue whales, fin whales, and humpbacks, arranged respectively according to numbers captured. During the fishing season 1914-15, from December to March, in the area covered, South Georgia to the South Sandwich Islands and along Coates Land to the head of the Weddell Sea, the records of whales were by no means numerous. 2 records only could with certainty be assigned to the humpback, and these were in the neighborhood of the South Sandwich Islands. Pack ice was entered in lat. 59 degrees 55 minutes south, long. 18 degrees 28 minutes west. And blue whales were recorded daily until about 65 degrees south. Between lat. 65 degrees 43 minutes south, long. 17 degrees 30 minutes west, on December 27, 1914, and lat. 69 degrees 59 minutes south, long. 17 degrees 31 minutes west. On January 3, 1915, no whales were seen. On January 4, however, in lat. 69 degrees 59 minutes south, long. 17 degrees 36 minutes west. 2 large sperm whales appeared close ahead of the ship in fairly open water, and were making westward. They remained sufficiently long on the surface to render their identification easy. Farther south, blue whales were only seen occasionally, and fin whales could only be identified in 1 or 2 cases. Killers, however, were numerous, and the lesser piked whale was quite frequent. There was no doubt about the identity of this latter species as it often came close alongside the ship. From April to September, inclusive, the sea was frozen over, with the exception of local leads, and whales were found to be absent. In October whales again made their appearance, and from then onwards they were a daily occurrence. Identification of the species, however, was a difficult matter, for the Endurance was crushed and had sunk, and observations were only possible from the ice floe or later on from the boats. The high vertical spout opening out into a dense spray was often visible, and denoted the presence of blue and fin whales. The lesser piked whale again appeared in the leads, close to our camp floe, and was easily identified. An exceptional opportunity was presented to us on December 6, 1915, when a school of 8 bottlenose whales, Hyperoodon rostratus, appeared in small pool alongside Ocean Camp in lat. 67 degrees 47 minutes south. Long. 52 degrees 18 minutes west. These ranged from about 20 feet to a little over 30 feet in length, and were of a uniform dark dun color, the large specimens having a dull yellow appearance. There were no white spots. At the edge of the pack ice during the first half of April 1916, about lat. 62 degrees south and long. 54 degrees west. Entrance to Bransfield Strait, whales were exceedingly numerous, and these were chiefly fin whales, though a few seemed to be sei whales. It is interesting to note that the fishing season 1915-1916 was exceptionally productive, no less than 11,860 whales having been captured in the Falkland area alone. The South Atlantic whaling industry, then, has reached a critical stage in development. It is now dependent on the captures of the large fin and blue whales, humpbacks having been rapidly reduced in numbers, so that the total stock appears to have been affected. With regard to the other species, the southern right whale has never been abundant in the captures, the sperm whale and the sei whale have shown a good deal of seasonal variation. Though never numerous, and the bottlenose and lesser piked whale have so far not been hunted, except in the case of the latter for human food. The vigorous slaughter of whales both in the subantarctic and in the subtropics, for the one area reacts on the other. Calls for universal legislation to protect the whales from early commercial extinction, and the industry, which is of worldwide economic importance, from having to be abandoned. The British government, with the control of the world's best fisheries, is thoroughly alive to the situation, and an interdepartmental committee, under the direction of the Colonial Office, is at present devising a workable scheme for suitable legislation for the protection of the whales and for the welfare of the industry. Appendix. Chapter 2. The Expedition Huts at McMurdo Sound. By Sir E. H. Shackleton. The following notes are designed for the benefit of future explorers who may make McMurdo Sound a base for inland operations, and to clear any inaccuracies or ambiguities concerning the history, occupation, and state of these huts. The National Antarctic Expedition's hut at Hut Point, the head of McMurdo Sound. This hut was constructed by Captain Scott in 1902, by the expedition sent out by the Royal Geographical Society, the Royal Society, the government, and by private subscription. Captain Robert F. Scott was appointed to the command of the expedition. I served as 3rd lieutenant until February 1903, when I was invalid home through a broken blood vessel in the lungs, the direct result of scurvy contracted on the southern journey. The Discovery Hut was a large strong building, but was so draughty and cold in comparison with the ship, which was moored 100 yards away, that it was, during the first year, never used for living quarters. Its sole use was as a storehouse, and a large supply of rough stores, such as flour, cocoa, coffee, biscuit, and tinned meat, was left there in the event of its being used as a place of retreat should any disaster overtake the ship. During the second year occasional parties camped inside the hut, but no bunks or permanent sleeping quarters were ever erected. The discomfort of the hut was a byword on the expedition, but it formed an excellent depot and starting point for all parties proceeding to the south. When the Discovery finally left McMurdo Sound, the hut was stripped of all gear, including the stove, but there was left behind a large depot of the stores mentioned above. I was not aware of this until I returned to McMurdo Sound in February 1908, when I sent Adams, Joyce, and Wild across to the hut whilst the Nimrod was lying off the ice. On the return of the party they reported that the door had been burst open, evidently by a southerly blizzard, and was jammed by snow outside and in. So they made an entrance through one of the lee windows. They found the hut practically clear of snow, and the structure quite intact. I used the hut in the spring, i.e. September and October 1908, as a storehouse for the large amount of equipment, food, and oil that we were to take on the southern journey. We built a sort of living room out of the cases of provisions, and swept out the debris. The southern party elected to sleep there before the start, but the supporting party slept outside in the tents, as they considered it warmer. We still continued to use the lee window as means of ingress and egress to avoid continual shoveling away of the snow, which would be necessary as every southerly blizzard blocked up the main entrance. The various depot parties made use of the hut for replenishing their stores, which had been sledged from my own hut to Hut Point. On the night of March 3, 1909, I arrived with the southern party, with a sick man, having been absent on the march 128 days. Our position was bad, as the ship was north of us. We tried to burn the magnetic hut in the hope of attracting attention from the ship, but were not able to get it to light. We finally managed to light a flare of carbide, and the ship came down to us in a blizzard, and all were safely aboard at 1 a.m. on March 4, 1909. Before leaving the hut we jammed the window up with balks of timber, to the best of our ability, in the storm and darkness. The hut was used again by the Ross Sea section of this last expedition. The snow was cleared out and extra stores were placed in it. From reports I have received, the Discovery hut was in as good condition in 1917 as it was in 1902. The stores placed there in 1902 are intact. There are a few cases of extra provisions and oil in the hut, but no sleeping gear, or accommodation, nor stoves. And it must not be looked upon as anything else than a shelter and a most useful pied a terre for the start of any southern journey. No stores nor any equipment have been taken from it during either of my two expeditions. Cape Royds Hut. For several reasons, when I went into McMurdo Sound in 1908 in command of my own expedition, known as the British Antarctic Expedition. After having failed to land on King Edward VII Land, I decided to build our hut at Cape Royds, a small promontory 23 miles north of Hut Point. Here the whole shore party lived in comfort through the winter of 1908. When spring came, stores were sledged to Hut Point, so that should the sea ice break up early between these two places we might not be left in an awkward position. After the return of the southern party we went direct north to civilization, so I never visited my hut again. I had left, however, full instructions with Professor David as to the care of the hut, and before the whole expedition left, the hut was put in order. A letter was pinned in a conspicuous place inside, stating that there were sufficient provisions and equipment to last 15 men for 1 year. Indicating also the details of these provisions and the position of the coal store. The stove was in good condition, and the letter ended with an invitation for any succeeding party to make what use they required of stores and hut. The hut was then locked and the key nailed on the door in a conspicuous place. From the report of Captain Scott's last expedition the hut was in good condition, and from a still later report from the Ross Sea side of this present expedition, the hut was still intact. Cape Evans Hut. This large and commodious hut was constructed by Captain Scott at Cape Evans on his last expedition. The party lived in it in comfort, and it was left well supplied with stores in the way of food and oil, and a certain amount of coal. Several of the scientific staff of this present expedition were ashore in it, when the Aurora, which was to have been the permanent winter quarters, broke adrift in May 1915, and went north with the ice. The hut became the permanent living quarters for the 10 marooned men, and thanks to the stores they were able to sustain life in comparative comfort. Supplementing these stores from my hut at Cape Royds. In January 1917, after I had rescued the survivors, I had the hut put in order and locked up. To sum up, there are 3 available huts in McMurdo Sound. The Discovery hut with a certain amount of rough stores, and only of use as a point of departure for the south. Cape Royds hut with a large amount of general stores, but no clothing or equipment now. Cape Evans hut with a large amount of stores, but no clothing or equipment and only a few sledges. Depots south of Hut Point. In spite of the fact that several depots have been laid to the south of Hut Point on the barrier. The last being at the Gap, the entrance to the Beardmore Glacier, no future expedition should depend on them as the heavy snowfall obliterates them completely. There is no record of the depots of any expedition being made use of by any subsequent expedition. No party in any of my expeditions has used any depot laid down by a previous expedition.